and welcome back to our little woman den. Today's comment shout-out goes to Skirmish of Wit and Lit, who says, I suppose you could argue that Laurie growing up wealthy is partly what contributed to him not valuing work. He never had to worry about not having things or not being able to afford what he wanted. In that regard, his exposure to the Marches, and the March sisters in particular, was fortuitous because they helped to enlighten him. Laurie is definitely not stupid. He's just more or less indifferent to academia. Not everyone is, and I like that Alcott sort of points that out with his character. Meanwhile, Jo lusts after learning. She feels like she can never know enough. I have spoken about this before, but erasing Laurie's growth as a character erases everyone else's growth as well, and if you do that, there is no story. Putting two female characters against one another is a very common Hollywood trope. Interestingly, it is often brunette versus the blonde. Think about Marilyn Monroe and Jane Russell in Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, Elle Woods and Vivian Kensington in Legally Blonde. Legally Blonde, I must say, is refreshing because it subverts the plot, but I think Warner Huntington III summed up the problem when saying that he wanted Jackie and not Marilyn. People often praise Jo for being a tomboy and how she is rejecting femininity, but Jo's idealization of the masculine has very toxic elements. Amy is a character who is more governed by her brain, whereas Jo is in fact governed by her emotions, which is considered a feminine trait. In the novel, Jo struggles to show her feelings because she thinks that it's weakness and, quote, feminine. When father is wounded at the war, she tells her sisters not to cry or show emotion. Couple years later, Laurie says that she doesn't show emotions and calls her out about it, because Jo tries to shut down an important human part of herself simply because she considers it too feminine. It actually becomes something that slowly eats her inside and contributes into her loneliness. This is why the umbrella chapter is so important, because Friedrich says to Jo that it is okay to be vulnerable. Amy does the opposite. She considers rational marriage with Fred Vaughan because it allows her to secure her family's financial future. When Laurie reminds Amy that she is her mother's daughter, and she simultaneously inspires Laurie to become a productive member of the society, Amy allows herself to listen to her heart and her own feelings and allowing herself to become more open, and it is this inner work that the couples do in Little Woman that makes these relationships work. Unfortunately, the adaptations rarely pay any attention to this. There are people who have not read the novel, have only seen the films, and they don't understand why the couples end up together. This is because the adaptations never bother to show what actually happens between these people in the novel. Another quote from Skirmish, Wit and Lit. Maybe Louisa was more of a romantic than people sometimes give her credit for. After reading about Louisa's relationships between real-life Friedrichs and Laurie's, I'd say she definitely was. Louisa was a transcendentalist, and one of the methods that the transcendentalist used was so-called self-scanning, which basically means trying to understand and analyze the feelings and the experiences that you are going through. Louisa practiced this throughout her life, and she put lots of consideration to the true meaning of love. When Louisa grew up, most marriages that she saw were unhappy marriages, because they were arranged marriages. Louisa herself answers this question about the equality within marriage rather beautifully, and her own wishes from marriages seem to have remained the same throughout her life. This is a quote from one of the early Louisa May Alcott stories from the time when she was in her 20s. You have given your idol a heart, but no head. I would have her humble, though self-reliant, gentle, though strong, man's companion, not his plaything, and willing to face storms as well as sunshines, and share life's burdens as they come. Let me advise you to take head as a pilot, for you may find, as I have done, that the voyage of life is not quite a pleasant trip. I would not be above you as I am now, not yet below, like poor Amelia in the garden, but here where every woman should be, at her husband's side, walking together through life's light and shadow. Here she is actually echoing both Amy and Jo. In the matters of the heart, one should combine both head and the feelings. This episode is sponsored by Audible. I am currently reading the biography of Charles Follen. This is a book that Louisa May Alcott read at the age of 12. Get this, it is a story about Eliza, who was an American female writer, and Charles, who was a German immigrant, a philosopher, and an abolitionist. Here we have prototypes of Jo and Friedrich, and it even gets better. Charles's full name was Carl Theodor Christian Friedrich Follen. His names were Theodore and Friedrich. That's insane. Charles was a good friend of Louisa's uncle, Samuel May, and Louisa actually met him a few years before this book was published, and he seemed to have left quite a big impression on her. I've said this before, but Jo is not only based on Louisa, but also ladies she admired, like Eliza Follen, who indeed married a kind-hearted German immigrant. I will make an episode about Eliza and Charles in the future. You can get 30-day free trial on Audible and listen and read as many books as your heart desires, with the affiliate link you can find from the description. This is Small Umbrella in the Rain, Little Woman podcast, all about Amy. Louisa loosely based Amy's character to her younger sister May. Louisa was more boyish and May was more feminine, and like Amy, she slept with a clothes peg in her nose when she was 12. Unlike Amy, who in the book comes to the conclusion that she does not have the genius, May embodied genius. She was a professional artist, and her paintings were exhibited in Paris Salon, and she even wrote and published a book for young female art students called Studying Art Abroad and How to Do It Cheaply. When Louisa and May were young, there was a great deal of rivalry between them. Both were very impulsive and temperamental, and both loved attention. Louisa often called May as the baby of the family, since she was the youngest and often got her way, which annoyed young Louisa. Amy in the novel is shorter than Jo. She has a button nose and heart-shaped face. May and Louisa looked more similar. They were tall and handsome women, with the exception that May was blonde and a lot more feminine. Louisa had dark brown hair, grey eyes. She spent a lot of time outside, and she was often quite tanned, which was not considered very attractive in the 19th century, and she had a high temper. Knowing this, it is easy to understand why she would envy May. Kerr's father, Bronson Alcott, he believed to the idea of an ideal man, and that this ideal person would have a blonde hair, blue eyes, and angelic nature. Bronson was also an abolitionist. He was an active member in the Underground Railway, and the Alcotts hid black slaves in their home, and he lost his teaching position because he took a black child to his school, which also happens in Little Woman. Now you'll ask, isn't that contradicting? And it absolutely is. For example, Emerson was often vague with his stance on the topic, whereas Henry Thoreau was very active in the abolitionist movement, which you can also see in Little Woman, when Jo and Friedrich take black children to their school, and Friedrich is largely based on Henry. Same way as Jo and Amy in the books, Louisa and May did become closer when they matured and learned to control their tempers. They even made trips to Europe together. There is a great deal of Louisa herself in Amy's character, and this might surprise some people. There were times when Louisa did consider marrying for money instead of love, until her mother persuaded her otherwise. In Little Woman, it is actually Amy who says that, "I have learned to sail my own ship, and I am not afraid of storms." The trip that Amy takes with Aunt March in Europe is actually based on Louisa's own experiences in Europe. It is very sad and ironic that there are people who say that, oh, Amy stole Jo's trip, when the trip was actually based on Louisa's own trip. Louisa had lots of insecurities about her looks, and she often compared herself to her sisters, May especially. When Little Woman became very popular and fans started to visit Louisa's home, they were often disappointed when they saw her, because for some reason they imagined Jo to be very pretty and young. Imagine your fans coming to meet you and be disappointed when they saw you. Louisa was very tall. She was taller than most men. According to her niece Lulu, Louisa always had sort of a masculine air around her. She was not very graceful, and that she had a very low voice, like a man's. In the end of her life, Louisa was very ill due to mercury poisoning, so it is very likely that the illness also affected to her appearance. Amy in the novel is written to be someone who is a very visual person. She likes to make things pretty around her. Jo is written to be the opposite, someone who doesn't care that much about looks or appearance, at least not in the beginning of the novel. Laurie in the book is written to be pretty, but the way he is treating Jo is far from pretty. Frederick is written to be unconventionally attractive. He loves her. Henry Thoreau, in fact, he occasionally criticized very feminine ladies, but lots of Henry's critical views were created by consumerism and his critical thinking about capitalism. What he really was criticizing was women who spent a lot of time and money for their appearance. It is easy to see why Louisa had feelings for him. In Little Woman, Jo is horrified with the ideas that she should go to a ball or go for social calls because they require her being more feminine. Friedrich is written to be unconventionally attractive because Jo is unconventionally attractive. Being beautified by love is a big part of their romance. Same way Laurie is written to be conventionally attractive because that way he appeals to Amy's sense of beauty. What often happens in Little Woman films is that the filmmakers gush how pretty Laurie is and then they explain Jo rejecting Laurie by saying that Jo must be gay or ace because it is so difficult for them to understand that Louisa May Alcott or Jo in the novel was not somebody who cared that much about the conventionally good-looking guys. The entire promotion of the 2019 film was based on that. Laurie's creepy behavior towards Jo is constantly being erased in the adaptations, and his storyline with Amy. In the books, the events that lead into burning Jo's manuscript begin much before any theater tickets. I will read you an article from the blog Contagious Grace. I will put a link to the sources if you want to leave her a comment. Quote, I just saw where someone said that Amy deserved to die in the ice because burning Jo's manuscript was basically the same as killing Jo, and I call that bull. First off, the moment we start prizing the created thing over creation, people, whether that's in our literature or in real life, then I believe we miss the point of art. So jot that down. Second, Bronson Alcott, Louisa's father, had this belief that people could be perfect, that you were born a blank state, and with careful correction and guidance you could stay that way. His first daughter supported that theory. She was compliant and thoughtful and quiet and sweet. Theory proven. Also, he taught. When Louisa came along, she was wild and rebellious and utterly imperfect. From the start, shattering his theory, he adjusted. He came to believe that if you just work hard enough and diligently enough, you can perfect yourself. This was the kind of moral philosophy Louisa grew up with. Personally, I see it as insufficient and utterly imperfect, but it has some merits, truths wrapped up in it. The primary one being that, 1, people can change for the better. The start of Little Woman, the book includes Mommy gifting each of her daughters with a copy of Pilgrim's Process, an allegorical tale about all the obstacles and temptations and struggles that a man passes through in life in the pursuit of God. And Mommy challenges her girls to pick up their burdens and embark on their own journeys. Each of them have different sins and struggles that are their burdens. For Jo, that is her pride and temper. For Amy, it's her pride and envy. In this situation, Amy burning the manuscript and Jo letting Amy fall through the ice, both of their greatest sins are on full display and both see the very real potential consequences of their sins. Amy doesn't lose her sister's love because she falls through the ice, and Jo gets a chance to realize that her anger and unwillingness to forgive could have caused not just her relationship with her sister, but her sister altogether. They literally and figuratively survive it all. They get grace, and in that grace they grow. Consequences of bad choices have to be experienced, seen in some way to generate growth. This is true both in life and in storytelling. And in this way Alcott illustrates the two ideas at the core of her thesis. People can grow and be better, but they can only become the best versions of themselves. The ideal woman is not just a quiet woman who stays home and cares for her children and sews her family's clothes. Nor is the ideal woman a writer who supports her family through her talent. Nor is she a great artist. She can be all of those things or none of those things. She must simply be good while being herself. To divorce yourself from yourself is to divorce yourself from who you were made to be. Meg's personality and dreams are Meg's personality and dreams for a reason. Jo trying to live Meg's life wouldn't have made her a better person. And so on with each sister, just as little Louisa could not be little Anna. All four women grow to become the people they were meant to be, and while doing that, they also become better morally. Jo's stubbornness and anger and pride transforms her into a determined, loving and sacrificial woman who has honed her talents for the good of others as much as, if not more than herself. Amy's envy and pride and obsession with appearance transforms into humility and integrity, and loving the people around her in a way that makes them more beautiful versions of themselves. This is long-winded and probably making less and less sense, so I will end with point 3. Don't come for Amy, she is my girl. In the Little Women group that I am part of, there was a discussion on the portrayal of this scene in the 2019 film. I will read you that as well. And this is from Forbes Romanov. Rewatching Little Woman and I am annoyed at Jo March. Was Amy burning her journal a shitty thing to do? Yes, it was, and as a writer myself, I am not excusing it. If someone destroyed all my writings, I'd be very mad too. Would I physically attack them over it, though? No, I would not. Jo is also annoying me when they neglect to inform Amy that Beth is sick. Jo says, Amy has always had a talent for getting out of the hard things in life. Sorry, what? Amy gets attacked by you. Amy gets hit by her teacher. Amy has to be without her father. Amy gets sent away from her family when Beth is first sick. Amy nearly drowns. Amy deals with her family neglecting to inform her that her sister is sick. How is that Amy getting out of the hard things in life? How is it Amy's fault for not being told that her sister is sick? Not to mention, Amy also had to miss her sister's funeral because no one had informed or prepared her beforehand that Beth was sick. Also, Jo saw Amy coming to the ice skate with her, and Laurie and neglected to warn her about the very thing that led her to nearly drown. We saw Laurie warn Jo. This was answered by my friend Christina, who runs the best Little Woman blog in the world, which is under the umbrella in Tumblr. In regards to Jo attacking Amy, Jo was notorious for having a terrible temper, and the event on the ice rink is what made Jo realize her mistake in overreacting and not controlling herself. The fact that her sister nearly died because of her made Jo want to become a better person and learn how to better communicate with people. This is probably why it felt like Jo was such a terrible person throughout the movie, because the lesson didn't stick. The way Jo treated Amy after the ice skating incident was one of my biggest complaints with the movie. Nowhere in the book did Jo continue to harbor harsh feelings towards Amy or ever felt that Amy got out of things. If anything, Jo was more disappointed in herself for not being what Aunt March wanted in a companion, was happy for Amy and Laurie being married because she knew they were perfect for each other. It constantly felt as though Gerwig was pitting Jo and Amy against each other for no other reason than to make you want to like Jo more, but the characterization of Jo in the movie is just god-awful. I am not sure what Gerwig was trying to achieve with adding unnecessary conflict between these two instead of showing their character growth within themselves and in their relationship with each other. I have heard a couple people saying that Louisa somehow made 180-degree turn with Amy's character when she started to write Little Woman Part 2. I disagree with this because in the first part of the novel, Jo's flaws are very much out there and her temper is very much out there. In Part 2, when sisters actually start to get more close with one another, this is a natural part of life and also something that happened in reality. Louisa made it grew closer as they matured and they started to understand each other better. Amy's behavior as a child was childish because she was a child. Jo's behavior is also childish because she is constantly making fun of Amy because she is so girly, and Amy makes fun of Jo because she is so boyish. Only adaptation which shows arguments from both sides, and not just Amy making fun of Jo, is the Modern Little Woman adaptation from 2018. All Jo's moral lessons have to do with her temper, but also the fact that Jo can be very judgmental. All Amy's lessons are about her vanity and popularity. In the beginning, Amy's desire to become a lady is a way for her to get out of poverty. But as she grows, it becomes a tool for her self-improvement, and thanks to that, Amy begins to control her temper beautifully. In an interview, Gillian Armstrong, who directed the 1994 film, said that there should always be 2 actresses to play Amy. There are over 20 adaptations of Little Women and only 2 versions where child Amy has been played by a child actress. In most Little Women adaptations, 12-year-old Amy has been played by an adult woman. For some time now there has been a theory going on that Amy did have a crush on Laurie already as a child. I tried to read the book this way and I think it does work. It is an interpretation, but it does give a deeper context. Why did Amy burn Jo's manuscript? Because a 12-year-old does not necessarily know how to handle their feelings in a mature way, especially if they have a crush to their big sister's best friend. The 1994 film does have a sweet scene with young Amy and Laurie in the carriage together and a promise of a kiss. I have heard some people complaining that Amy's and Laurie's relationship is creepy in the 1994 film. Maybe this comes from the people who remember Laurie transitioning from a teen to an adult in the film. But Christian Bale was 19 when he played Laurie. 2019 film, on the other hand, has been criticized that Timothée Chalamet does not go through the transition, so he never looks as an adult in the movie. And if I remember right, he was 24 during the filming. 2018 and the 2019 films go with this idea that Amy already had a crush on Laurie as a child. Kirsten Dunst has later revealed that when she played Amy in the 1994 film, she had a big crush on Christian Bale. Art imitates life. Amy has been given a stamp of a social climber, but she isn't one. And for some reason that I don't understand, this scene from a Little Woman book is not in the adaptations. I may be mercenary, but I hate poverty, and don't mean to bear it a minute longer than I can help. One of us must marry well. Meg didn't, Jo won't, Beth can't yet, so I shall, and make everything okay all around. So the reason why Amy wants to marry rich is so she can take care of her family. Amy grows up in an environment where there isn't a great deal of options for women. She believes that marrying well, she could uplift her family away from poverty, even if it would mean that she herself would not be the happiest person. Jo in the first book is a walking contradiction. She wants to be equal to men, which is what gender equality and feminism is all about. She is also constantly making fun of her feminine sisters, which is inherently anti-feminist. She makes fun of Meg because she wants to fit into the circles of Sally Moffat and other young ladies. She constantly mocks Amy when she uses fancy words and her desire to become a lady. A great deal of hatred that Amy receives has been caused by the fact that Amy likes to be a girl. It is hate towards the feminine. Her movie and TV portrayals are rarely flattering. In the 1933 film and in the 1949 film, Amy is first introduced standing in the middle of the classroom holding a sign which says, "I should be ashamed of myself." In the book, Amy is introduced together with her sisters before Christmas when father is at the war. Introduction is sweet and does not make a mockery of her or anyone else. Jo and Amy are perfect mirrors of each other. Many ideas about the masculine that Jo used to cherish and admire were quite harmful. Amy's early ideas about the feminine were not very realistic either. She connected femininity to very shallow things like being popular and the shape of her nose. Amy's desire to become a lady was never fully supported in her immediate family, and Jo especially was making fun of it. When Beth became ill and Amy went to live with Aunt March, Aunt gave her the structure to become what she wanted. when Amy starts to approach becoming a lady in terms of self-improvement, largely thanks to Esther and Aunt March. In the process, she learns to control her temper and becomes a kinder person. Because Amy's femininity has been so heavily demonized, we never see her growth process in any adaptations. Take Little Woman 2019. We see Amy taking Laurie's advice, but we do not see Laurie's whole growth process being positively influenced by Amy and encouraging him to actually becoming a productive member of society and go to work for his grandfather, which is what happens in the novel. In the chapter calls, Amy and Joe go for a series of social calls, which were part of women's role of the time. Joe despises these calls like she despises most of the female labor of the time. Joe tries to avoid speaking with the ladies, and more than once she runs out to play with the boys. Amy loves Joe, but she is hurt because Joe is making fun of something that is important to her. Joe doesn't take any of these calls seriously, and her own insecurities also bring out her temper. When they go to visit Aunt March and Aunt Carol, Jo dismisses them and puts herself above them. At the same time, Aunt Carol is wondering which girl gets to go to Europe, and Amy makes a better impression. Calls has never been adapted into movies, probably because it shows Jo in a bad light. Yet it would be important to adapt it because it does not only show how much Amy has matured, but also how the conversations between Jo and Amy are more respectful, even if they would disagree. The 1994 film does not have any scenes from the calls, and the viewer doesn't get any explanation why Jo was not chosen. The 1994 film also frames it to happen right after Jo has rejected Laurie's proposal, which in the book happens much later on. In the novel, Jo is very mad and jealous to Amy when she hears that she has not been chosen. She is way more mad at herself, but she doesn't want to admit it. This also parallels Jo's and Laurie's tempers, because neither one of them like to admit if their own actions hurt other people and rather put the blame on someone else. In the 2019 film, we once again do not see Jo putting herself above the aunts and losing the trip to Europe. Instead, we only see Meryl Streep telling Jo that she is not coming. Film also tries to pinpoint Jo's and Aunt March's similarities by pointing out Aunt March as a happy spinster who only cares about money, when in the novel Aunt March is a widow and sad and unhappy because she had lost her child and her husband, who she dearly loved. In the book, Amy feels terrible for getting something that Jo so badly wanted, and Jo did not want to show her own disappointment, but to be supportive, which is a proof of sisterly love. Amy matured a great deal when she was in Europe. She became more graceful and more serious. Amy also loved Aunt March more than anyone else in the family, and truly enjoyed the company of her aunt. There are lots of things I could say about Jo losing her trip to Europe and people blaming that on Amy. Once again, that entire narrative is entirely constructed by the filmmakers. Amy's portrayal was better in Greta Gerwig's film, but even that one has received lots of criticism for portraying young Amy as an immature brat, because an adult woman should not play a 12-year-old. In an earlier script of Greta Gerwig's film, after Jo found out about Amy's and Laurie's engagement, she wanted to punch Amy. This diverges too much from the novel. Even when the writers say they want to do a good job with Laurie and Amy, they can't seem to escape their Jo and Laurie obsession. Book Jo never likes Laurie romantically. This triangle is repeated in all adaptations because we don't see Laurie's character arc. We fail to understand why Jo rejects him. In the 2017 series, Jo became really cross when she found out about Amy's and Laurie's engagement. The 2018 film is probably the only one that shows that Laurie is clearly more of a brother to Jo. And yet there is a scene where Jo says to Beth that Amy stole Laurie from her. None of this is in the novel. The whole reason why Jo traveled to New York was because Laurie was harassing her, and she was actually scared to spend time with him alone. In the novel, even before Jo finds out that Amy and Laurie were engaged, she says to Mommy that she thinks Amy and Laurie would be a good couple. Why this has not been adapted? Louisa partially based Laurie's character to her Polish friend Ladislas Wisniewski. They met in Switzerland in 1865 when Louisa was working there. and Ladislas was quite flirtatious with Louisa. So he was 21 at the time and Louisa was about 32. A year later, May Alcott lived in Paris at the same time with Ladislas. This has made many Alcott scholars believe that there was some sort of rivalry between the sisters about this young man, but the letters between Louisa and May show that they both became quite tired with him. They call him boring and say that he does not take his life or work very seriously. Julian Hawthorne was the next-door neighbor of the Alcotts. It seems that he had a crush on May, but May was 6 years older than Julian, so she probably did not feel the same about him. After the publication of Little Woman, Julian apparently spread a rumor that he had been the model for Laurie. However, this is not something that Louisa ever confirmed. Julian was not very interested in school or work, and he came from a rather comfortable family setting, like Laurie, and May had tried to encourage him to study and make his family proud. Alf Whitman was one of the real-life Lauries as well, and friend of the Alcott sisters. Alf was 5 years younger than Louisa, but only 2 years younger than May. Alf and May were very close, and when May moved to Europe, they continued writing letters to one another. But when Alf was younger, and the sisters connected with him through their theater hobby, young Alf was drifting and quite lost with his future plans, and both May and Louisa tried to encourage him to study and become more productive, which is also something that happens in Little Woman. And Alf being Laurie's model is something that Louisa has confirmed. In the novel, Laurie is not a prize that the two sisters are fighting over. In the novel, both Amy and Joe are frustrated that he is wasting his life away. He only goes to school to please his grandfather, and he does not want to work. There is literally a chapter in the novel called Lazy Lawrence. Both Amy and Joe are working-class girls, and Laurie is rich. And in the novel there are scenes where he says that he does not understand why Jo wants to write and why it is so important for her to make her own money. No matter how hard Jo tries, she can't get through Laurie, probably because Jo's relationship to Laurie was very maternal. Jo wanted to go to university, and Laurie took his education for granted. All the real-life people who were models for Friedrich's character were one way or another connected to education, or the academic world, and literature. Louisa herself was an advocate for female education, and in her journals from the time when Louisa was in her 20s, she wrote about her future wishes of starting a school and possibly running that together with Henry Thoreau. Then we have all these real-life Lauries who I believe were smart young men, but for some reason were not interested working or studying. Some of them, like Alf, did decide to be a useful member of society and made the sisters proud. In the novel, Laurie is not stupid. It is mentioned that he graduates with honors in Latin, and Amy is especially proud of him, but he is lazy. Do you think Jo would despise me as you do? Yes, if she saw you now. She hates lazy people. Why don't you do something splendid and make her love you? I did my best, but it was no use. Graduating well, you mean? That was no more than you ought to have done. For your grandfather's sake, it would have been shameful to fail after spending so much time and money when everyone knew you could do well. This scene reveals that Laurie did not go to university for the sake of studying. The book also describes how in the university Laurie is a party boy and he flirts and gets into troubles. In Little Woman, even though Amy is 4 years younger than Laurie, she is a lot more mature than he is, and it is only thanks to Amy Laurie puts his act together. The 2019 film includes Laurie saying Amy that she should not marry Fred for the sake of money, but the film does not show Laurie doing any work for Amy. Laurie doesn't have any kind of growth process in the movie. In one of her interviews, Greta Gerwig said that Laurie wants Jo to step into the world of adulthood. What is the book that she has read? Laurie in the book is the one character who does not want to grow, and the only reason he wants to marry Jo is that he wouldn't need to take any responsibility on his life. This is what Laurie says in the book, after he has fully internalized everything that Amy has said to him. She is right, talent isn't genius, and you can make it so. That music has taken the vanity out of me, as Rome take it out of her, and I won't be a humbug any longer. Now, what shall I do? Some readers have struggled reading the part 2 because it portrays Jo in slightly less favorable light than in the part 1. Jo has a heavy masculine trajectory. In part 1, she and Laurie are brothers. Jo wishes that she could be a soldier and fight in the war like her father. If a reader reads too much to Jo, they see Amy as an annoying little sister because that's how Jo sees her. In part 2, it is now Jo who struggles to fit into the surrounding society. Amy, who has more feminine trajectory, is better accepted to the conquered society. When Jo was still living at home, it was okay for her to behave like a boy, and family didn't see too much harm in it, but when she grows, this old model of masculinity does not suit her any longer, and neither she wants to conform to the traditional female role. When Laurie proposes to Jo, he expects her to give up writing and become a socialite, and be something that she wasn't. This is why Friedrich's character is important, because he does not ask or want Jo to conform. Because Jo looks very different and more masculine than other women, she felt she could not find anyone to love. If I quote my podcaster pal Emily, Little Woman as a book was also written to offer hope to those who feel that they are never going to find love or are not worth of loving. Amy sees the value of the feminine work, good societal status, and all the wonderful things that prosper when you know how to make the best of it. Losing the trip to Europe became the first step in the terms of Jo's feminist awakening. Jo realizes that her temper is out of control and the ideas of masculinity that she has been admiring are not working. In the first part of the novel, Jo had difficulties to identify with Meg's pain when Laurie forged letters in the name of his tutor. In the beginning of the second book, when Jo becomes the target of Laurie's unwanted attention, it is now that she begins to understand what it feels like when someone does not respect your boundaries. This is repeated in the fourth book, Jo's Boys, when Jo is in her 50s and on a full feminist mode. She scored some of the young male students who treat girls like objects. In Jo's Boys, the character of Nan and Tommy Banks also echo Jo and Laurie. Nan studies to become a doctor and Tommy is studying medicine, but he isn't that interested from it. He has ulterior motives. Jo is really annoyed by Tommy's behavior, so when Tommy unexpectedly falls in love with someone completely different, Jo is very pleased and Nan is also relieved. From Amy, Jo learns to value the feminine labor and not to underestimate women. Taking care of Beth brings out the nurturing side of her, and it also makes her to examine her own life in a new light, and losing Beth beautifies the domestic tasks. From Meg, Jo learns that equally respectful relationship can be worth pursuing. Jo struggles to fit into the traditional feminine role. Friedrich does not fit into the traditional masculine role, but he doesn't struggle with it. He is comfortable of being who he is. His intellectualism and philosophical background complements Jo's feminist views. Amy's desire to improve herself already exists in the first novel, when she doesn't want to wear the ring Aunt Marge has given to her, and when Marmee asks why, Amy says it is going to be a reminder for her not to be too selfish. What is also interesting is that in the first part of Little Woman, Laurie puts himself above Meg and Jo, but he does not put himself above Amy. For example, when Amy is writing her will, Laurie does not dismiss or scoff her, but instead is very supportive and sweet to her. The problem with Hollywood turning Laurie into the perfect boy next door is that in the minds of many that turns him into an award for the sisters to fight over, when that is not part of the book's narrative. Amy is also a feminist, but it is not straight-to-your-face feminism to which Jo's feminism eventually develops. For example, Amy plans to open a charity that would help women to break into the male-dominated art market. Both Amy and Jo were raised in the same politically aware home, and both were encouraged to think outside the box. Thank you so much for listening. Take care and make good choices. Bye. Hello, Little Woman fans. It was about time that Emily and I got together to talk about Amy and Jo. Today's comment shoutout goes to Niina, who says the following. Remember, in Little Woman, when Joe desperately wants to go to Europe with Aunt Carol, but is passed over for the trip because she isn't refined enough, and Mommy says that Joe probably wouldn't have enjoyed the trip anyway, because Joe would have to be prim and proper the entire time. So can we talk about the fact that Joe's eventual husband is German, loved her for her personality and not in spite of it, and if they had enough money, would have willingly taken her to Europe and let her be herself while there. What a great observation, and all true. This would have applied Joe marrying Laurie as well. She didn't love him, but also Joe knew that if she would have married him, not only would she have been lonely, but also required to be something that she wasn't. A lady. That was something that Louisa struggled with. She was a very masculine-looking woman, and it does seem that even some Little Women fans made fun of her looks when they saw her, which is pretty insane. But I also read that Henry Thoreau, the real-life Friedrich, he was sometimes quite critical about overly feminine women. Henry was very critical about consumerism, but you can definitely see why Louisa fell in love with him, since he didn't really care that much about women who were overly feminine. And so the story of Joe and Friedrich intertwines to Louisa and Henry's reality. I always thought that Joe and Fritz did travel to Europe together when Joe wrote her bestseller, which happens between Little Man and Joe's Boys when Joe is in her 40s. I thought they went to Germany and France. Joe would go to a book tour and Fritz would accompany her. Louisa mentions that Friedrich's nephew Franz moved to Berlin and married a German girl, so they would visit him, and then Fritz would show Joe around Berlin. All fanfic writers and filmmakers, feel free to use my headcanons anytime. I don't know if I am the only person who struggles with this, but I always have hard time liking Amy and Laurie as a couple in the adaptations, and it has everything to do with today's topic, that Laurie is being reduced into a trophy who the sisters are fighting over, and that never happens in the novel. My Amy and Laurie shipping begins when he goes to see her at Aunt March, and it continues to adulthood when he is composing an opera for Joe, and the only things that come to his mind are Joe's worst qualities, and Laurie even calls her as Torment, which kind of shows his shallow dreaminess, but it's also a wake-up call to reality, and that's when Laurie starts to grow from a boy to a man, and he takes Amy's advice and goes to work. It is not just the recent adaptations that don't show Laurie's growth and his character arc, or Amy's good influence on him. It is every Little Woman adaptation. It is a very deeply integrated issue, and the way the feminine girls are put against more masculine girls in pop culture, that is something which contributes the very black and white views on womanhood. This is Small Umbrella in the Rain, Little Woman podcast, Amy and Joe, two sides of the same coin. There was an older version of Greta Gerwig's script where Joe wanted to punch Amy when she heard about their engagement. Even if Greta Gerwig says that she wanted to do a good job with Amy, she's still participating to this triangle that doesn't exist in Little Woman.
Well, yeah. Well, I really hate the rivalry that Greta Gerwig sets up between Joe and Amy. It's almost just like, oh, they're fighting over who gets to be more glorified and artistic, and they're also fighting over who gets to be with the guy. You know, I wonder if Greta Gerwig was sort of like, oh, well, what if Joe won out because she got to be the artist, but then Amy got to keep the guy? And which I'm kind of like, well, this kind of rivalry between them, it wasn't in the book. These two sisters, they just had conflicting personalities. That's why they would fight a lot. They wanted different things too. I mean, like Amy wanted to be an artist, but she also wanted to be rich, and I think she had a different idea of how to reach social mobility. And she was like, oh, Joe, like, you know, you should have some more manners, and then Joe was just like, I don't know what you want me to do. Like, you know that whole chapter where they're visiting people and Joe can't get anything right? Like, they were just conflicting personalities, and I think that is just kind of how a lot of sibling relationships are. You're just different people. And so I hated how, like, you know, Amy was just like, oh, I hate how, like, Joe is always, like, this person who gets everything, and I don't want to be in the shadow of this person, which, like, to an extent, like, Book Amy probably feels a little bit, she also makes Laurie work for it a bit more. I didn't appreciate that sort of rivalry, and the fact that it came down to who got to have the man, who got to have Laurie, I hate that. That's so superficial, actually.
Yeah, it's so shallow.
Yeah, it is really shallow.
If you want to add, you know, the characters, the arcs of the female characters, then you should add the arcs of the male characters as well. I'm so tired that I can never see them. There's the reason why the relationship works. You know, Laurie becomes a better person because Amy's helping him. And then Amy, she realizes that she shouldn't marry Fred because it's all the wrong reasons. And then with Joe and Fredrik, I think with Joe and Fredrik it's more about being authentic and also finding home. When I was younger, I kind of hoped that they would have stayed in New York and be this bohemian couple. But then, now that I'm hopefully a bit more perceptive, I think that's not really suitable for either one of them because with Fredrik, he's not very happy when he's in New York.
No, he's not.
And Jo is also missing her home when she's in New York.
Yeah.
So it's all about finding a family, starting a family, being a family.
Yeah, it's about growing up and moving outside of your own family, becoming independent, and then forming a family that's yours and actually, you know, belongs to you. Because I guess as a kid, you're always in a state of being pushed away. And, you know, one day you are, you know, probably going to leave, in all likelihood. Yeah, but in the end, that's what the story is really about. It's really not about people finding glory in their creative aspirations. It's about becoming a productive individual, but also along with that, family is also important as well. So we talked about Amy, where she's kind of the best interpreted in the 2019, I would say, because when she brings out, like, oh, well, you know, this is my status of, as a woman in life. Like, you know, I become accomplished and the best on my own, or it depends on my marriage. You know, which I think it's good to bring that historical context in. But the thing is, if you bring in that aspect of the historical context and not everything else, then you're not being honest about your motives or your creative motives in this adaptation. And I know that somebody said in my comments, was trying to argue with me and said, oh, well, it's trying to be realistic. The 2019 is trying to be realistic. You know, when people their dialogue is overlapping, even when the sisters are talking over each other and stuff, in, like, the beginning scene, they were getting on top of my critique. They were saying, oh, well, it's more realistic that way. And they're trying to be realistic about Amy, you know, as well in her situation in life. And, you know, it's trying to prevent these people as being real. And I'm like, well, if it's real, if it's so realistic, why don't they even get the costumes right? Why don't they even get the history right? You know, these very basic things. And they were like, oh, well, it's a pseudo-realism. And I'm just like, get out of here. Get out of here.
That's so funny.
Oh, no, people are trying to come up with mental gymnastics to justify all these things. Back to Amy, like, you know, I like that interpretation of her, and I like the acknowledgement of what she goes through. And I think, you know, a good message to take away, which underlines what we've been talking about the message of the book, is how she learns to use her passions productively. It's like, well, okay, well, even if you're not a great artist, why don't you contribute to the state of art? Why don't you do something else that, you know, still makes you a useful person? And I really love that even though she wants to marry rich, ultimately she marries rich, but also she chooses to be a productive individual. You know, when she was younger, maybe she thought, oh, I'm just going to marry and never have to work. In fact, Meg also has that idea. Well, but then they ultimately choose to make something of themselves, which I would like to see, you know, appreciated. This is also a very American narrative as well, being a productive person.
It's very true. There are people who are Joe fans and they hate Amy, and Amy fans who hate Joe. But I think, you know, the problem there is that if you are a Joe fan and then you hate Amy, you kind of fall into this narrative that Louisa May Alcott had. I just recently read this study how Louisa had problems sometimes to, put herself into position of other women because of her own sort of masculine trajectory. But then she grew out of that when she became more mature. And I think that is what happens to Jo. That scene of Laurie catfishing Meg, and then Jo covering that up. Like, she forgives him in a second. A lot of people have problems with that. But I think if you go with that narrative of, okay, I'm going to forgive Laurie as well, and I'm just going to go along because Jo is so great. And then you have the part of, Jo losing the trip to Europe. The chapter calls, and she puts herself above the ants. And then you go with that narrative as well if you're a big Jo fan. Like, Jo didn't do nothing wrong. Like, the ants were wrong. And I'm like, the ants were going to France, and Jo is like, I hate French. Why would they want to take her with them? She just said that she doesn't like French.
Why would they take you to Europe if you don't like French, where you have to speak French?
Yeah.
You have to speak French.
Yeah. Amy can go because she speaks French, and she's not trying to put herself above the ants or say that she's better than them. But I can see how some people would go with that narrative that Jo is the best quote-unquote feminist person because they just read the book like that from Jo's perspective. And they don't question her. Yeah, so it's somewhat hate against being a girl.
That's the problem when you read Jo as a sort of a self-insert character, and you acknowledge that she has flaws, and that's why she didn't get to go to Europe and all that other stuff. Yeah, I'm really against taking Jo as a self-insert because, I mean, she was like, an analog for Louisa, but, she isn't for all of us to be a self-insert. Even if you're creative, you don't always have the anger management issues that she had. Even if you're a creative person and want to be a writer, maybe you don't have the discomfort with her femininity that she has. The fact that she looks down on, emotional expression really has such contempt for so-called feminine shows of expression. I don't know how we ignore this. The fact that she is kind of sort of a repressed misogynist in a way. She almost doesn't really like her own gender. I think some people read queer narratives or read a queerness into Jo or think she's trans but the thing is, from the book, I read her as she wants male privilege, I think. Yeah. And she wants to be a man. That's my interpretation.
I am sort of half in the trans theory section, but that's probably because I have been reading so much about Louisa. But then again, I also have problems with that theory because I was reading some of Louisa's diary markings from the time when she was in her 20s, and then, later in life, when she had extra money, she liked to buy, clothes. So Louisa May Alcott liked fashion. When she had Henry or someone else coming for a visit, she would brush her hair in front of the mirror, trying to be presentable. I can get behind some of these theories, but not all of them.
It's interesting to think about. I can definitely see that she was a bit gender fluid, but it's sort of like how, Frida Kahlo, the artist, she liked wearing men's clothing, but she also really liked the feminine part of herself. And as she grew into that, we can kind of see a very something of a similar situation with Jo. And I'm sure Louisa herself, I think, she kind of liked experimenting with that, and she probably was less strictly female in that sense. I can see that she was a bit gender fluid, and Jo a little bit.
Observing her sister's friendship with Julian, same with Off Whitman, who was also one of the models for Laurie. But I have a very unconventional opinion that Louisa May Alcott was somewhat lovesick person with her relationship with Daddy Wisniewski, because, there's the theory that he was a con man. It would kind of make sense that she would make these public statements that, this guy was a model for Laurie, and, he's great and all that. And then with the letters that she wrote with May, they're criticizing him because Louise had her publisher sending him money. He never paid it back. And that kind of sounds like a con man behavior.
Yeah.
She met him in Switzerland. This was a year before she wrote Little Woman. And he was flirting with Louise's employer and with Louisa. Something happened between Ladislas and Louise's employer, and he had to leave the premises.
I think I read your blog post, and then also a bit of other information about him. He seems like a character. He is quite a character.
It's interesting because he becomes this Laurie archetype in Louisa's novels that she always writes about, but the Joe-like character never ends up with him. The Joe-like character always ends up with the Frederick archetype. And I think that's so interesting.
Yeah, no, that is really interesting. It's really interesting to see how writers take like little bits of experience in their lives and kind of mold it into their narratives, and you can just kind of see these little snippets from her life. That particular, he seems a little shady and also a little bit dashing.
There's the Faustian connection.
Yeah, definitely. I guess I find it really funny that there's Amy fans and Joe fans. Like, they have to be in opposition to each other, where I feel like, yes, they're the stronger personalities of the group. It's when did you have to pit two sisters against each other? That is so strange. Like, what are they even competing over? Like, they're not even competing over Laurie, which is not even a thing. Because, I do like that, Amy is now being appreciated. I do really like that. I feel like the adaptation to 2019, it makes her deeper, but also more superficial at the same time in how it pits her against Joe, but then also, reveals a lot of her motives, reveals a lot about her mindset. I like that, but I also don't like how, I'm, gonna take this guy, and I don't want him if he's still into Joe. I never really got on board with that, and because I always felt like she was a person who knew her worth. She doesn't have to be in competition with anybody when it comes to anything like this. I recall that you didn't really like the 2017 adaptation interpretation of her. I guess, did you not like how negatively she was portrayed?
Yeah, maybe it was also the actor's age, because I think they should have had a 12-year-old play Amy. But I think it was the part of the cause where she gets the trip to Europe, because I felt that in the book Amy was very, very sad that she got something that Joe didn't get. But then in the 2017 adaptation, she was kind of gloating when Joe didn't get to go, and I think kind of martyrized Joe in the same way as the 2019 does. So I didn't like that aspect of the 2017 series. I think it might have had one of the best Fredericks. But
I feel like no adaptation justifies why Amy went instead of Joe properly. Yeah. They're either Joe was too boyish for Aunt March, or just chose Amy because Amy is just more artistic. They don't show how she really messes up that opportunity for herself. That is legitimate, I think. But an interesting detail of 2017. Remember that part before Joe discovers that Amy burned her book, and Joe actually gives her some candy, and then Amy kind of shows regret over doing what she did.
Yeah.
I think that's an interesting detail, how it kind of shows she's just kind of a kid who's just really messed up. I think that was a really interesting addition to that scene. But I think the fact that she and Laurie don't really have that kind of completing arc they should have had, I think that's something that's missing. And you also notice nobody ever really delves into her days at Aunt March's either. When that's also a big experience for her, where she's isolated from her family, and nobody really goes into that bit. That's an observation.
Yeah, I think they did some of that in the 2017 series. When Laurie came to see her, that was nice. And then
there was that bit. Yeah, you're right.
Then there's the carriage kiss in the 1994 film. Somebody asked me about how Amy has sort of that arc with the servant of Aunt March. I can remember the name of the French maiden. And she kind of introduces her to Catholicism, which has never been adapted, but it's really interesting because she is meditating, this 12-year-old girl, praying for Beth, and I think that was really nice, and I always liked that scene. It's never adapted, but maybe most filmmakers don't think that's very relevant, but I think it's really big for Amy's arc, because before that, I think the problem with Amy and Joe in the first book is that they are triggering each other in very negative ways, because Amy's using these long fancy words, and Joe is you shouldn't speak like that. She's really, really mean to her sometimes. For a while, they sort of become a bit closer when she returns, because she has become a bit more better at rejecting Joe's triggering points, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, that does make a lot of sense.
And then in the beginning of part 2, there's this great scene that I really like. The narrator mentions that sometimes when they were arguing, they bursted out laughing because they realized how silly it was.
Yeah.
Both sisters grew away from that petty fighting. When I was younger, I was arguing with my sister. I don't think I have argued with her since high school. Become more perceptive about the other person's temper when you know them very well. And I think that sort of happens with Joe and Laurie as well. Like they are being triggered with certain things that the other person does.
I think that's part of just being adults. Is that when you're a kid, you kind of you see things very much from your own perspective, and you can't really get why the other person just can't come into your own mindset. But then you like when you're an adult, you see that other person as another like valid human being who has their own needs, and that's just part of growing up. And I think one of the benefits of being an adult, which is why I don't think Greta Gerwig should just think that adulthood is like this horrible, glum experience when you actually mature and actually your life gets better in many ways.
And I was reading some bits of May Alcott and how Louisa started to appreciate May after she had passed away in a more wider sense. They did become a lot closer when, later in age. You can really see that in Little Woman. Alcott schooler Emmeline Birch, she also wrote that there has been neglect among some Alcott scholars to do more research on May Alcott because Amy's portrayals in the films. Part of that also applies to certain characters like Laurie and Fredrik as well. Laurie's not that exciting when his character arc is missing. I am okay with Laurie being a flawed person, and I liked him a lot more when he is this flawed person, even though he annoys me, because, I can appreciate his growth when he is this flawed person. Yeah, and with Fredrik, I think he's very enchanting with his Germaniness and, how, Louisa was very into Germany and all that. You don't really see those in the adaptations, so maybe there are not that many people who want to research them. I read tons of studies on Joe, and some of them were good, some of them were not so good, but then it was a lot more difficult to find anything on Laurie or Fredrik or their real-life counterparts.
I feel like people are kind of colored by the sort of popular imagination of these characters, and so they just don't delve into the research as much. I mean, I think that exploration of men growing up as well, I think, is also a really valid thing to acknowledge. The presence of toxic masculinity in Laurie, I think it does make him a lot more interesting. And the fact that that aspect of him is erased, it kind of leads to that over-romanticization of him. We've talked about a few times before. And so I think the commenter of mine talked about how hard it is to adapt Little Women really faithfully, because she's like, oh, well, there's all these different scenes that are very episodic, and it's very hard to adapt into the book. Or into a film or a show. I guess in a sense, yes, because when you have something very dense like Little Women, people forget how long it is. Yes, it's very hard to adapt every detail, and it's hard to put in everybody's arc. It's just hard to do. But I also feel like when you want to make a new adaptation of Little Women, you don't try and drastically change it. You go into things that already exist. You delve into other aspects of the story that maybe people haven't acknowledged as much before, and then you explore those things. And I feel like, an exploration of Laurie as someone who is essentially a toxic man, toxic male, and just becomes someone much more mature and able and actually a more productive person, I think, would add so much more to a feminist message. So I just feel like there's so much untapped ground in adaptations, which I feel like people don't acknowledge as much.
Laurie's toxic masculinity, that sort of goes along with Joe's toxic masculinity, and how that affects this quote-unquote feminist narration of the novel. If you just say that only tomboys are feminist, that's only going to harm the feminist movement. That's not very realistic. With Louisa May Alcott, she has this sort of idealized idea of masculinity, but then again she also has these very critical views about masculinity as the novel progresses. That's really untouched ground in the adaptations. There is no balls to do that, or there hasn't been balls to do that yet. Maybe in the future. That will be interesting to see, hopefully.
Oh yeah, I would definitely like that.
Thank you for listening. Take care and make good choices. Bye. Hello everybody. You guys have asked me to do a roast on the 2019 Little Woman. It is not a secret that I do not like this movie. I seriously wonder if some of the actors had to write some kind of an agreement that they are not allowed to speak against this movie, or Greta Gerwig. Still, I didn't want to do a roast because I didn't want to watch the film again. But then my friend Little Woman blogger Christina saw the problem and asked me if I would like to make a ranking on different Little Woman adaptations with her. These rankings will appear in the season 4 of the Little Woman podcast and in the Little Woman channel here on YouTube in the spring of 2023. We also roasted, demolished, undermined, destroyed the 2019 film. So this episode is for all of you who have been asking for this particular content. This episode is sponsored by Skillshare, and if you want to learn a new skill, you can get 1 free month on Skillshare. I have also started a Patreon account for the Little Woman podcast, so if you are a fan of this channel, you can support this channel as little as $5 per month and get access to early content. This is a Little Woman podcast, Greta Gerwig's Little Woman, How to Lie to Your Audience and Almost Get Away with It.
I feel like this is fair, like that's going to be, and yours at the moment is the 94 one, but I don't think much is going to change because we both know what our dead last is. And it's the last in this list of rankings, the 2019 version. We don't, there is no discussion on that. It is dead last.
When you asked me, like, can we do a ranking? And I was like, do we have to watch the 2019 again? No.
That movie is burned in my brain so much. Like, there are times I just randomly think about it, and I'm just like, and I can't myself worked up over it. To nobody but me, I just sit in my room, I'm like, fucking hey, that moment. Like, someone brought it up, and I'm like, oh, that's right, I forgot, like, because I told my mom, like, when we were watching it the first time, I said, like, oh, like, this film tricks me, because they add in these little things, I'm like, oh, that was in the book that I've never seen anybody do, and then I'm like, but then when I think about it, it's just not right. Like, somebody was, like, mentioned about, like, so in the book, at some point, Amy wants to expand her skills in art from beyond painting. And she tries to do sculpting. And she puts plaster in a bucket and puts her foot in it. She's trying to learn how to do that. That's the motivation behind it. The 2019 film, Amy's motivation is to give something to Laurie to remind her of her pretty feet.
Jeez.
So just so you know, everybody, 2019 Laurie has a foot fetish. Apparently. I just was like, when I saw someone put that, I was like, oh my god, like, it just keeps getting worse. Like, I just look back on it, like, and I reevaluate a lot of the things I thought were okay, or like a lot of people, like, I think in my review, I was like, oh, I thought that apron scene was actually pretty good, and I'm like, was it though? Like, now that I'm, like, really seeing it, I'm like, it wasn't as hot and heavy as I think people try to make it be. Like, Pride and Prejudice hand flexing scene, it is not. So, yeah, that film is a train wreck, and it is rightfully at the bottom of the list.
It's funny about that foot thing, because I was thinking, like, well, if we have this Amy who in the movie is 20-something, why would a 20-something person give a copy of their foot to a guy? Like, that doesn't make any sense.
And I gotta say, I don't want to criticize her acting in general, because I've only ever seen her in one thing. But Florence Pugh is the worst Amy. I'd rather listen to the 1970s Amy whine and screech than have to deal with Florence Pugh's Amy. because I feel like hers is like almost borderline psychopath. Just the way that she so calmly talks about how she, why she burned the book. I was just like, are you kidding me? And my mom, I've seen a few more adaptations than she has. She hasn't seen this like 70s one or the Masterpiece Theater, but she's seen all the other ones. And she was like, and her name's Amy too. So she always feels a little defensive towards Amy. But she was like, wow, this is the first time I don't like Amy. I was like, and that's the problem, because she's read the book like once or twice when she was younger. So she was like, I'm not too familiar with everything in the book, like the way you are. But, even then, like, she still looks at the adaptation and goes, okay, Amy is not so bad of a character, but, like, she was like, this Amy, I don't like her at all. Holy crap. But, yeah, I say this more the script. I don't exactly want to criticize the actress because I've not seen her in anything else. So I don't know how I feel about her acting in general. But I just do not like Florence Pugh as Amy here. As a child, definitely not, and I'm just kind of about her as an adult. But I think that's, again, just the script. Because she just goes on and however she is. Very contrary, because in the book, it's Laurie that chases Amy down in France when she's in the carriage. But in this movie, she's the one that chases Laurie down and acts kind of ridiculous, screaming and whatever else. Totally not in character of Amy.
Yeah, I think it was Greta Gerwig who said that, we admire these girls because they don't want to grow up. And I'm like, no, Amy definitely wants to grow up if you read the book. Like, she wants to know what it's like to be a woman, and she wants to become this mature person, a true lady. But then when I watched this movie, and I've only seen it, I will never watch it again. I wish that I hadn't seen it. But like that moment when Aunt March comes like, Amy's going to go to Europe with me, just so you know. Like there isn't like any explanation why Jo can't go, because they didn't include the scene of her from the chapter calls. But like Amy is like, why nobody is happy for me? And then Mommy goes like, oh my poor Jo, you really should have gotten the trip. And it's so completely opposite to the book, because in the book Amy feels bad for Jo and Mommy says that, no Jo, you really caused your own misery. You were rude to the ants. That's why you lost the trip. It's so confusing because we are supposed to see Amy as this mature person who can handle things. And then she just complains that nobody's happy for her. And I'm like, I cannot admire this Amy and I cannot admire this Jo. This is like a woman-child trope that I hate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I was going to say, there's not even like a half-ass line of like, oh, well, I'm taking Amy with me to Europe because Amy and I get on better than you and I ever did. Which is, in a way that it is true. I think that is something that at some point someone says, whether it was Aunt March or Jo kind of admits to herself, like, we would not have gotten along better. But yeah, there's not even that kind of, it's just, very abrupt, like, Amy's going with me and sucks to be you, Jo. Like, and Amy really did not, again, gain any sympathy for me. Like, when she's sitting there like, why is nobody being happy for me? Like, I'm here. The film's so confusing for me. Like, I like Laura Dern. I think she's, in general, a wonderful actress. But all I could think of Marmee in this is like a soccer mom. Like this, I'm not like a regular mom, I'm a cool mom. Like when Laurie first comes and meets Marmee, and I think he says like, oh, hello, Mrs. March. And she's like, oh, just call me Marmee. Everybody does. Like, what? No. Or the one moment that really gets me in regards to like how Marmee reacts to something. In the trailer, this was very deceiving. In the trailer, we see the girls messing around in their own home, and Marmee saying to Laurie, like, oh, my girls can be a bit of a handful. And it's like, okay, in the safety of their own home, they can be, wild little animals. But really what happens in the movie is after Amy hurts her hand and she's I don't know, blubbering to Laurie and being weird. The days then, she and the sisters, the marches, because Mommy's obviously there too, go to inside the Lawrence's house, and they're all jumping all over the place, screaming. They are like acting like banshees. And I don't care if it was back then or today. No good parent would just allow their kids to just go nuts and like jump over cushions and, you know, put their hands on everything without, you know, acting respectfully. And Marty is just like, oh yeah, this is just how my girls are. And I'm like, if I had acted that way in a stranger's house, I probably would have got a good whipping, right? At least a good, you know, like talking to and like being grounded, like, you know, no TV for a week or something like that. I got secondhand embarrassment from just seeing that. Like, how do you, and especially of that time period, how do you sit there and just go like, you know, oh yeah, this is totally fine. Marmee would never have allowed it because she still wants them to act like respectable people. Obviously not to dampen their spirits or to take away anything, but act like adults, act like human beings. Oh God, that moment.
I had so many problems with that film. I mean, we already talked about Uncle March, but you know how, like in this movie, Aunt March is supposed to be a spinster, but then this really bothers me. If she's a spinster, why she's constantly trying to marry these girls when she's kind of supposed to be this model of independent woman for Joe, but then she constantly wants girls to marry rich. Like, isn't that contradicting?
It is, and I was going to say, too, the other thing, too, is it makes Aunt March seem even meaner, because if she never married and she's rich, because I'm just thinking of that moment when Joe's like, when Aunt March is like, oh, you need to marry rich, and Joe's like, well, you're not married, you're not married, and she's like, well, that's because I'm rich. It makes Aunt March seem even meaner, because if she is rich, by whatever means it is, why isn't she helping the family versus, you know, when her being married into it? Like, do you know what I mean? Like, it just kind of seems like, because I presume, I don't really know much of the economics of, you know, what women's agencies exactly were back then, but I feel like marrying into money, even if you are a widow, you still have very limited access to your husband's money. Whereas in this, it seems like, oh yeah, I got the money on my own, but I can't give you the money for whatever reason because I'm a Scrooge McDuck type person. Like, that's how it kind of felt like to me. Like, they were clearly suffering financially, and she is just not helping in any way. It made Aunt March a lot colder than I think she should have been.
Yeah, that doesn't make any sense to me, because if she is this rich spinster, why she wants everyone to get married? And so, all the listeners who don't know, Aunt March in the book had a husband who she loved very much, and they had a daughter who died, and that made her very grudgy lady. Even though if she's a millionaire, she's not very happy person because of that.
And you can almost kind of see that her wanting to push the girls to marry as a way of being like trying to sort of in a way see the girls as like her own daughter. Like, you know, I want to make sure you're okay, but I just immediately think of this movie with Betty Davis called The Old Maid. Great movie. Very, I gotta say, for the time and when it was made, at least in my opinion, I thought it was a little like how they managed to get away with it. But her character, Betty Davis' character, has a child out of wedlock, and she has her sister-in-law. She goes to live with her sister-in-law who has kids, and her Betty Davis's daughter has no idea that she's her daughter, and she pretends to just be like this aunt who is very stern on her because she's worried that she'll let it slip somehow, even in being affectionate towards her, that she's the mother. In some small way, I always see like Aunt March being in that kind of sense of like, I can't let it slip how much I care, because worry that something bad will happen if she does, or I gotta be the stern aunt, that way they can steer in the direction that they need to go, type thing. So I never seen Aunt March as being this wholly unfeeling individual, just kind of stern and wants what's best for the girls. But yeah, here I just kind of felt like she wasn't as nice as she could have been.
And you know, there was an older version of the script where it didn't have this split ending, but Joe did end up with Fredrik, and he was German. And I read that script before I watched the movie, and then I was very confused because it was completely different. But I don't know, I heard that there were many different versions of the script, and there was one older script where Joe wanted to punch Amy after she heard that Laurie and Amy were engaged. I think it was an interview with Vogue where Greta Gerwig said that, oh yeah, she wants Saoirse and Timothée Chalamet together in all possible ways. So, okay. And then there are these interviews where she says that Joe should have ended up with Laurie. Then another interview, Joe should have been gay. Joe should have been an asexual. And like, if you would have made Joe, for example, to be gay in this movie, or like have a full-blown Joe and Laurie relationship, I might have more respect for this movie. But now it's just fishing viewers.
Yeah, because you're trying to appeal to every audience who has an opinion on this, rather than sticking to your guns and saying this is how the story is. Yeah, I never read the original script. I see bits and pieces online, but like, I feel like if I read it, I'm just going to get mad because I'm going to sit there and go like, that was a much better moment in the script than it is in the movie. And I really don't like the split ending. I truly believe that no matter what ending, Joe's unhappy. If you believe the ending where she gets to publish her book, one, she's lonely. As we've established in the scene with her big old monologue of, women are, bright and brilliant, but I'm like, and I'm sick of it, but I'm lonely. Like all that whole scene. And her writing to Laurie saying, please marry me because I'm lonely, which does not happen at all in the book. In the end, she's lonely. She's still lonely. Sure, she may have gotten her book published, but she's lonely, and she's pressured by her editor to add romance in order to get it published. No matter what, she's not happy in that regard, even if her book is published. But then if you follow the ending of, Joe gets to be with Friedrich and whatever has her school, it's not happy because there's probably like one scene, really, or two, where you had thought like, this is actually going in a good direction of Joe and Friedrich's relationship. But then everything after that spirals out of control with her leaving New York being like, you're mean and I don't want to be your friend. And then when he comes to Concord, she's like, somewhat happy to see him, but then when he leaves, he's like, I'll be going west if you ever come around. She's like, no, I don't think I'll have a reason to come around. Like it just didn't feel as genuine, and the pressure between Amy and Meg to be like, you love him, let's get into the carriage and drive up and watch you be in the ring. Like, it was very weird.
Yeah.
In general, that whole sequence was weird. Too modern. It felt like she was being pressured to like get into the carriage and go after Friedrich, rather than it being very genuine. So yeah, no matter what, no ending. The ending in that for Joe is not happy. So it makes me very impressed to think about it. To that Don who, keeps saying, I feel sorry for Amy because she doesn't get to, Laurie just wants to be with Joe. How is this? I'm depressed at the fact that in the 2019 film, Joe's unhappy no matter what. Because that is, for someone that says how much she loves Joe, Gerwig really, it felt more like she hated Joe.
She was like, she seemed to have hated Fredrik's character, first of all, when I have read her interviews. Like, she complains that Joe was forced to start a school for boys. Like, if you read the book, Joe is the one who wants to start the school, and then she was like, he forces Joe to stop writing. That never happens in the book. Joe constantly keeps on writing and he always helps her. So why did you lie to people? But then it goes on, her making comments on his character and the way he looks and that he is, quote, old. So it always goes to that old Laurie good looking, Frederick not so good looking. She apparently thinks that Joe is rather pretty. She doesn't pay any attention to that. Laurie is harassing Joe in the book.
And there are times I'm sitting there going like, pot me kettle because Friedrich's too old for Joe. Well, what about your husband?
Yes. What about your child with your husband?
Right, I was going to say, like, there's a pretty good age gap between her and Noah Baumbach. Like, yeah, I was going to say that it's pretty close to similar to Joe and Friedrich are, because they're 60, and let me see. When I heard you say that, 13 years, because she's 39, he's 2. But still, like, how can you sit there and say that when your own husband is older, like, and a good 10 plus years older? Like you said, she's very hypocritical, and it sucks. It really sucks because I really liked Lady Bird. Personally, I thought it was a good movie, and I was excited for it because I was for This Little Women, because I was like, oh, this director is good, and Saoirse Ronan, I've always liked her as the idea of Joe, and Timothy Chalamet, I thought had a good chemistry between Saoirse Ronan and him. Not entirely too romantic. Have you seen Lady Bird?
No. I did saw Call Me By Your Name, so I thought, okay, he does good emotional roles, but I was really disappointed with this Laurie because he didn't do anything, basically. He was just there being pretty.
Yeah. And I was going to say, in Lady Bird, they try, at one point their characters try to be a couple, I guess, like Saoirse Ronan's clearly interested in him, and they kind of have a thing, but like it comes across like, and I think it's supposed to be rightfully so, their characters come across as being awkward together because he's very blasé about everything. Essentially the reason why her character likes him is because he's sort of the like cool outsider who doesn't care about anything, and he wants, so I was like, okay, like they have good screen chemistry together, so like this is going to be good in terms of, I could see them having a good screen chemistry as Joe and Friedrich, or Joe and Laurie, but yeah, I was just like, I didn't like how they were trying to push it. To me, it still felt very awkward. Again, very much, trying to make something happen. Like, there's that GIF. I don't know what cartoon it's from, but like this character is trying to put two people's heads together, and they're like, now kiss! And I feel like that's how Gerwig was with Saoirse Ronan and Timothy Chalamet. Just like, now kiss! And it's like, it's not gonna work. They're just not gonna be that couple. They're great friends. I've seen interviews with them, and they're like really adorable together as friends, but I don't know if I could see them as a romantic couple. They just don't have that feeling for me.
Now I feel kind of bad for them, and I don't really know that much about either. Yeah. There is this whole chapter in Little Woman 2019 film guide where Gerwig talks about how she wanted to make fun of Joe's and Frederick's relationship. And I read that and I was like, this person doesn't know anything about Louisa May Alcott. And when I have read Gerwig's interviews, she's like, oh, Louisa May Alcott hated marriage, Louisa May Alcott hated this and that. And I'm like, if you have read any Louisa May Alcott biographies, you know that she had a fling with the real-life Laurie, and she was in love with Henry David Thoreau. And to me, the whole thing about the split ending, either Joe ends up with this guy who, in the movie, she does not seem to be that interested, or she's happy to have this book published and be this independent spinster for the rest of her life. The book publishing part fails because the book is based on Louisa May Alcott's real-life relationships. with the real-life Laurie and the real-life Friedrich. So if you erase those relationships, like Gerwig is trying to do, you don't have the book. You don't have the entire story. So it just disappears. I mean, this movie would not exist if Louisa May Alcott didn't have those real-life relationships.
Gerwig felt like she didn't do as much research. I think at one point I had said, like, you know, Gerwig just read the Cliff Notes on, you know, and did her research. But yeah, like it felt like she was very dependent upon the myths and the stories of, like, you know, oh, you know, her editor pushed her to marry Joe off, and it's like, as I've learned from you, like, no, she didn't. Like, no, the editor never did, not for Joe, not for Meg, not for anybody. And saying things like, oh yeah, she didn't want her to be married, and whatever, you know, urban myths that are added into the world of Little Women. And it felt very much like she was just going off of that rather than having actually read the book and done her own research.
Yeah, it's more like fan fiction if you think about it.
Yeah. That made me think of someone, an anon, who had said, you know, 2019 Little Women is bad fan fiction discussed, and I'm like, oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's up there with whatever that weird fic I sadly can never get out of my head because it just absolutely ruined me, where someone wrote a fic where Teddy, Joe's son, is actually Laurie's son. And that's why, like, it has ruined, and I hate to say it that way, but, like, it has kind of ruined for me Joe naming Teddy after Laurie for me, because I just never can get that fic out of my head. I know some people say that's silly, you know, it's just a fanfic, but, like, that thing hurt my brain. It really did. So that's why my modern AU, he's not Theodore. I kept just having these, like, flashbacks of that fanfic, and it just ruined it for me. It really felt like a bad dream, a bad version of a wonderful novel.
Yeah. It did feel like, when I read her interviews, it was always a different story in a different interview. Like, if I hadn't read any of those, maybe I might have enjoyed the film, but, like, she kind of ruined the movie to me with these interviews, because, I mean, she's a celebrity, a lot of people know her name, millions of people read her interviews, and if they read her interviews where she says that, oh, Joe marries this horrible German, and then she makes these racist comments about him, and Greta Gerwig has, like, most German name in Hollywood, by the way, because she has German ancestry, so way to go. But, like, yeah, people are going to buy your narrative because they see you as an authority, and you just lie to these people.
Right. You're doing nothing to help change the narrative of what Little Women is. Like, you're sort of aiding and abetting the sort of, I would even say, toxic myth of what the story is, and ruining what Alcott would have felt. I feel like she's probably rolling in her grave with that adaptation, with the way people are getting her character wrong. And I hate to say it this way, because I am in no place to judge anybody when they're trying to, like, headcanon a character as being of an LGBT type. But it bothers me when people headcanon a character as an LGBT when it's based off of misinformation. Like when people say, oh, Joe is transgender because she prefers to be a boy, but it's like, she's not saying she prefers to be a boy because she feels in her heart she's a boy. She wants to do boyish things because, again, time period dictates that boys have more power and more control over things than girls do. And nobody's thinking of that. They're just thinking of, you know, what they see on the surface. And because I saw an article, I didn't read it because I don't know. Either it was lost on me, or our link wasn't working for me. But I saw someone put out an article questioning, like, oh, was Louisa May Alcott herself transgender? And I'm like, unless you have serious evidence that says she was, other than the fact that, oh, Jo, her character, who's her avatar, wanted to be a boy, and that's got to be case enough to prove that she wanted to be a boy herself. I'm not buying it. Again, I feel like if you can back it up with something legitimate that isn't just a stereotype of a LGBT thing, fine. Because I personally had canon Jo as being demisexual, demi-romantic. But I can at least back it up with these, with what I think and how, and having it be kind of legit rather than it being just like, because I just want her to be, or, because of this false misconception that I have of the character and how I think Louisa May Alcott would have wanted her character to be. Yeah, I've seen people get mad when I'm like, oh, I don't agree with Jo being a lesbian. There's not evidence in that. Like, there's more evidence of Amy being bisexual than I see evidence of Jo being. Because seriously, like, I think at one point she, like, said something like, oh, looking at, like, her classmate, she's so pretty. Like, if you have a stronger case of convincing me Amy's bisexual than you have of Jo being a lesbian, personally.
Yeah. To me, that Jo being gay theory, it fails pretty much in the beginning because Jo doesn't really like women in the book. She doesn't like to hang out with girls. And, like, from all the lesbians that I know, they usually, like, naturally go to hang out with the girls.
I think that's one of the biggest, one of the keystones of being a lesbian is being into girls.
Jo is so into boys. Like, first, she's, like, more in having the freedom that the boys have. But then when she meets Fredrik, oh my gosh, she literally, my favorite scene in the book, one of them, she literally moves her couch in the nursery so she can stare at him all day long. And then all these comments on, oh, I love that he's so masculine, he has these big hands and big feet. And Laurie is so girly, Laurie is so feminine. So, yeah, that's where, like, I can't agree with Jo being gay because that's the narration of the book. There are lots of moments in the book also where Jo wants to be very feminine. She likes to knit, she loves to make dresses, she loves being a mom, so I don't say that she only wants to be a boy because there's not really evidence of that in the book either. 2019 film, it was all about money and queer baiting, and I'm not a fan of that.
Yeah, my opinions of Gerwig has kind of gone down a bit. It's not even just she's ruined an adaptation of one of my favorite novels, but again, and as you said, I hadn't read the script, like the early drafts of it before seeing the movie or seeing any of her interviews before, and I already did not like the movie once I saw it, but now hearing sharing those interviews and seeing those quotes and all that, it makes me not only hate the movie more, like I went from being like genuinely I cannot tolerate it to absolutely hating it, but my opinion of Gerwig has kind of just gone down. I'm just like, at this point, almost ambivalent to like anything she does. I'd be worried if she had on her hands another adaptation that I would like, or even an adaptation other people would like, because I don't want anybody else to go through that misery as well. Because just like how I know a lot of fans of like House of Game of Thrones had that very disappointing ending, and then we in the Star Wars community was just like, oh, we're so sorry, and then we got our own disappointing ending. We're like, and all the Game of Thrones fans were just like, it's okay, we totally understand. Like, that's how I feel. Like, if Gerwig ever got her hand on an adaptation of a beloved novel, or at least it's a beloved novel to somebody else, and she ruins it, I would feel bad for that person, because like nobody should have their favorite novel get ruined. I mean, like right now, I'm not even. I feel so bad for the fans of Persuasion. I need a read the book. I have, like, someone gave me this, like, collection of 4 stories of Jane Austen, and I see people just rip the new Persuasion, a new one, because it is so bad. And I'm like, I feel so bad for you. I understand how you feel. I got my own bad movie adaptation of a beloved classic. So, yeah, it's becoming a weird trend lately of doing stuff like that.
Yeah, it's weird because the postmodernism is based on this idea that nothing is real. And Greta Gerwig's films are described to be postmodern. And then it's like, if you want to make a period drama that is based on a book that is based on someone's life, I don't think that should be postmodern. She's trying to sell her as this feminist person, but then, like, you have Jo wanting back this character who in the book abuses her. Where is the feminism in that? Or you have these quotes on this character being German and you don't like his accent. In the book, Jo loves that Friedrich is from Germany. Where is the feminism in that? I don't get it. All these comments how, like, oh, this movie is made by women for women, and then there are all these other Little Women adaptations made for women by women, and then you just kind of steal stuff from there that you want to fit into your version. Like somebody said, oh, Christian Bale's hairstyle, that's similar to Timothée Chalamet.
Yeah, this version it really was trying to play to the masses, because here's the thing, I feel like if you're going to be like a filmmaker or writer or whatever, you're going to have to be decisive and stick to your guns no matter what people are going to think. But it felt like Gerwig knew that people were going to be mad. You know, if Jo ended up with Friedrich, you're going to have the Laurie and Jo shippers be mad at that. But then if you have Laurie and Jo together, you're going to have people who...
Not too long ago, I got a message from one of my listeners who told me that they speculated that Saoirse Ronan is gay, and that is why she and Greta Gerwig kept saying that Jo says no to Laurie because Jo is gay. I know that Ronan has played gay characters, but I don't know about her personal life, and to be honest, I am boycotting everyone who has been involved making this film. I must say it is pretty odd that Gerwig is like, Jo is gay because she doesn't think that Laurie is attractive. And Jo is simultaneously in love with Laurie. And is she also like, Saoirse is gay and in love with Timothy. But I must say that makes the marketing of this film feel even more sinister. In an interview, when Gerwig said that she loves seeing her 2 favorite actors together in the films that she makes, and then she wants them to be romantic, that really echoes that the 2019 Little Woman doesn't have anything to do with Louisa May Alcott's Little Woman. This movie is not about Jo and Laurie as characters. Jo and Laurie don't exist in this movie. It is about Ronan and Timothée Chalamet and a director who wants them to hook up. And this is why I hate Little Woman 2019. There's nothing honest or authentic about it. And Laurie is based on Louisa May Alcott's ex, Laddie Wisniewski, and Friedrich is based on Henry David Thoreau, to who Louisa May Alcott was in love with, and there are all these erotic scenes between Jo and Friedrich in the books. If Little Woman 2019 was some kind of a coming out movie, I must say it was a pretty stupid way to come out. And I have no idea what the purpose of the film was. Based on all these contradicting things that Greta Gerwig has said, it seems that it was all about the money. I hope you enjoyed our discussion. I look forward to share new stories with you in the 4th season. Take care and make good choices. Bye! I was wondering if you have ever thought about Amy's religiosity. Like she's Protestant, but Esther kind of low-key influenced her on Catholicism. I don't know if that's the right way of putting it, but I thought the part about her little chapel was pretty interesting. To me, that chapter showed lots of Amy's growth, spiritual growth, in the sense that time at Aunt March really calmed her down. At home, she was often triggered by Jo, or Jo was triggered by her. There's the moment when Laurie comes to cheer Amy and she's writing her will. And it is a very cute chapter, but I think it also shows how Amy has been thinking a lot about death and mortality because of Beth's illness, and it is scary. Maybe some part of the aesthetics of Catholicism spoke to Amy's soul. The narrator mentions how she liked to look at the statue of the Virgin Mother. I remember when my father passed away, and I read lots of religious texts. And I am not a very religious person, but at that time it was something that was comforting. I found this quote from Gregory Iseline, who has studied Louisa May Alcott's views on religion. Although Alcott was often like Joe Bear of Little Men and Joe's Boys, who prefers to stay home while the others go to church, Alcott attended services at a diverse set of churches, from Parker's 28 Congregational Society and Charles C. Grafton's Episcopal Church of the Advent in Boston to a Roman Catholic Mass in France. She may have been actively interested in and accepting of a range of religious practices and ideas, because she embraced what her father called pure religion. The practice of a liberal mind is no seed, or what Parker called pure ideal religion, which is permanent, as opposed to the Christianity of the pulpit of society is ephemeral. Ultimately, she does not see any one religion as the sole source of spiritual truth, but instead thinks some truth or benefit can be found in variety of religions. Even when confronted by those who hope to convert her, Alcott tends to see common ground. As she writes of her meeting with the Episcopal Canon Knox Little, I found that we meant the same thing, though called by different names. Alcott repeatedly distances herself from spiritualism. For example, faith in immortality, on the other hand, is clearly one of her long-held beliefs, appearing in her private letters, as well as her fictional work. Yet, of all her specific identifiable beliefs, none was perhaps more important than her faith in the spiritual dimensions of the natural world. You can see a lot of that in Little Men, in Friedrich's teachings, the way he speaks about God's garden. I think for Louisa, the important part of Christianity was the practical side of Christianity. So, for example, in Amy's grief, the faith provides a tool for her to cope with her fear, the things that are happening at home. Thank you so much for listening. Like, comment and share, and check out the full Q&A episode where my amazing followers asked me very clever questions about Little Woman and Louisa May Alcott. Take care and make good choices. Hello, global community of Little Woman fans. Welcome to the Little Woman podcast. Today's comment shout-out goes to Ghost of a Snowfield, who writes, "For the life of me, I have never understood criticism of Amy March for marrying Laurie. People say she betrayed Joe, and it was such an uncool thing to do, as if Joe didn't reject him and not feel an ounce of romantic love for him. There is no betrayal if he and Joe were friends, and she never wanted him. Explanation point." End quote. And then that Scarlet Flycatcher has pointed out, hashtag, in the 2019 movie, when Joe, quote, forgives her, it's like, what did she have to be forgiven for? End quote. It's like what Christina said in our 2019 Little Woman roast. Greta Gerwig wants Joe to be the hero, but she also constantly wants her to suffer. But Book Joe never suffers from Amy marrying Laurie because she wants Laurie back like she does in the 2019 film. Joe envies Amy because Amy is happily married and Joe is lonely and wants a romantic partner. That is what is written to the pages of Little Woman. Cinema and I continue to analyze the chapter Surprises, and we are getting to the part where Laurie and Amy have returned back to Concord, and Laurie tells Joe that he and Amy are now married, and, like Ghost of a Snowfield pointed out, this is something that Joe is not angry or sad about. She's actually very, very happy for them. What Joe is sad about is that she's lonely. She doesn't envy Amy for Laurie, she envies Amy in general because Amy is happily married. Joe also envies Meg for having someone, and there is a part in this chapter where Joe is actually looking at Meg with a baby, and she grieves that she cannot ever experience that herself. If you guys ever read Caroline Dickner's biography of May Alcott, the real-life Amy, There are Louisa May Alcott's diary markings in that book, where she writes how she envied her sister's marriages and how very lonely she was. And Jo gets her happy ending because Jo is missing Fredrik and he comes back to her. And then in the chapter Under the Umbrella, Jo even says that he came back to her when she needed him the most. There is also a very important feminist message in this chapter because Laurie actually apologizes Jo to that he pressured her to marry him and harassed her. The only adaptation that I can think of that includes Laurie's apology is the 1970 BBC Little Woman, but it is not in any of the movies. What is also interesting to me in this chapter is how Laurie speaks about Amy. He cannot really hide how proud he is of her and how Amy makes him very happy. And season 1 of the Little Woman podcast has also appeared as an audiobook. You can find the link in the description. You can also follow me on Instagram at Podcasting Little Woman. My guest is Niina, and she's a long-time Little Woman fan, and she's also very knowledgeable about Henry David Thoreau, and we shall be discussing about Henry and Louisa's very interesting relationship as well. Niina and I met on Instagram a couple years ago, and she always has very good insights about Little Woman, and I hope you enjoy our discussion. This is Small Umbrella in the Rain, the Little Woman podcast, Laurie's apology to Jo, and the rejected suitors in Alcott novels. The bright-eyed girls are quick to see such traits, and will like you, all the better for them. And if death, almost the only power that can part mother and son, should rob you of yours, you will be sure to find a tender welcome and maternal cherishing from some Aunt Priscilla who has kept the warmest corner of her lonely old heart for the best navy in the world. So here we can also see Louisa May Alcott's maternal nature, that even though she is this Aunt Priscilla, she still has love for all these lost boys. This made me think how Louisa May Alcott gave lots of money to help different orphan houses. It's the same how Jo starts her life with Plumfield, that even if you are a spinster and you don't get your own children or find a partner, you can still use your time wisely by doing what you love. For Louisa May Alcott, it was to help children and start her own family that way. Jo must have fallen asleep, as I dare say my reader, as during this little homily, for suddenly Laurie's ghost seems to stand before her, a substantial, lifelike ghost leaning over her, with the very look he used to wear when he felt a good deal and didn't like to show it, but like Jenny in the ballad. She could not think it he, and lay staring up at him in startled silence, till he stooped and kissed her. Then she knew him, and flew up crying joyfully, "Oh, my Teddy, oh, my Teddy! Dear Jo, you are glad to see me then?" "Glad, my blessed boy, words can express my gladness. Where is Amy?" "Your mother has got her, down at Meg's. We stopped there, by the way, and there was no getting my wife out of their clutches." "You what?" cried Jo, for Laurie uttered those words with an unconscious pride and satisfaction which betrayed him. "Oh, the dickens, now I've done it!" And he looked so guilty that Jo was down upon him like a flash. "You've gone and got married?" "Yes, please, but I never will again." And he went down upon his knees with a penitent clasping of hands and face full of mischief, mirth, and triumph. "Actually married? Very much, thank you." "Mercy on us, what dreadful thing will you do next?" And Jo fell into her seat with a gasp. "A characteristic, but not exactly complimentary congratulation," returned Laurie, still in an abject attitude, but beaming with satisfaction. This reminded me how somebody commented on Tumble that in the 1994 film, they liked that how proud Laurie was to introduce Amy as his wife.
What can you expect
when you take one's breath away, creeping in like a burglar, and letting cats out of bags like that. Get up, you ridiculous boy, and tell me all about it. Not a word. Unless you let me come in my old place and promise not to barricade. Joe laughed at that, as she had not done for many a long day, and patted the sofa invitingly, as she said in a cordial tone, "The old pillow is up, Garrett, and we don't need it now, so come and fetch Teddy." How good it sounds to hear you say Teddy. No one ever calls me that but you. And Laurie sat down with an air of great content. What does Amy call you? My lord. That's like her. Well, you look it. And Joe's eyes plainly betrayed that she found her boy cooler than ever. The pillow was gone, but there was a barricade, nevertheless, a natural one, raised by time, absence, and change of heart. Both felt it, and for a minute looked at one another as if that invisible barrier cast a shadow over them. It was gone directly, however, for Laurie said with a vain attempt at dignity, "Don't I look like a married man and the head of a family?" "Not a bit, and you never will. You've grown bigger and bonnier, but you're the same scapegrace as ever." "Now, really, Joe, you ought to treat me with more respect," began Laurie, who enjoyed it all immensely. "How can I, when the mere idea of youth, married and settled, is so irresistibly funny that I can't keep sober?" answered Joe, smiling all over her face, so infectiously that they had another laugh, and then settled down for a good talk, quiet in a pleasant old fashion. "It's no use your going out in the cold to get Amy, for they are all coming up presently. I couldn't wait. I wanted to be the one to tell you the grand surprise, and have first skim, as you used to say when we scrabbled about the cream. Of course you did, and spoiled your story by beginning at the wrong end. Now, start right and tell me how it all happened. I'm pinning to know." "Well, I did it to please Amy," began Laurie, with a twinkle that made Joe exclaim, "Fib number one, Amy did it to please you. Go on and tell the truth, if you can, sir." Now she's beginning to marmot. "Isn't it jolly to hear her?" said Laurie to the fire, and fire glowed and sparkled as if it quite agreed. "It's all the same, you know, she and I being one. We planned to come home to Carol's a month or more ago, but they suddenly changed their minds and decided to pass another winter in Paris. But Grandpa wanted to get home. He went to please me, and I couldn't let him go alone. Neither could I leave Amy, and Mrs. Carroll had got English notions about chaperones and such nonsense, and wouldn't let Amy come with us. So I just settled the difficulty by saying, let's be married, and then we can do as we like.
So they did elope.
Yes.
It's quite sweet.
Yeah, and I also have to say I like how pridefully Laurie talks when he's talking that Amy is his wife. It's funny.
It is. He's very proud of her. I think Laurie was always that kind of person that he wanted to be married. But it's also because he was orphan and he grew up without a family.
And I also have to say, again, in this chapter, we also learn that he's very proud of her because I think he taught her a bit of piano playing or something like that.
Mm.
It's just a very sweet relationship. But I also have to say I love it that Laurie talks also in a very good manner to Joe. Like he for me, he talks respectfully to her now and not like in a disrespectful tone.
It is very different tone than in some of the earlier chapters. But
yes.
It shows how much he has grown as a person.
Definitely.
Of course you did. You always have things to suit you. Not always. And something Laurie's voice made Joe say hastily. How did you ever get Anne to agree? It was hard work between us. We talked her over, for we had heaps of good reasons on our side. There wasn't time to write and ask leave, but you all liked it and had consented to it by and by. And it was only taking time by the fetlock, as my wife says. Aren't we proud of those 2 words, and don't we like to say them? Interrupted Joe, addressing the fire in her turn, and watching with delight the happy light it seemed to kindle in the eyes that had been so tragically gloomy when she saw them last. A trifle, perhaps, She's such a captivating little woman. I can't help being proud of her." Well then, uncle and aunt were there to play propriety. We were so absorbed in one another, we were of no mortal use apart. And that charming arrangement would make everything easy all around, so we did it. "When? Where? How?" asked Jo, in a fever of feminine interest and curiosity, for she could not realize it a particle. 6 weeks ago at the American Consul's in Paris. A very quiet wedding, of course, for even in our happiness we didn't forget dear little Beth. Jo put her hand in his as he said that, and Laurie gently smoothed the little red pillow, which he remembered well. "Why didn't you let us know afterward?" asked Jo in a quieter tone, when they had sat quite still a minute. "We wanted to surprise you. We thought we were coming directly home at first, but the dear old gentleman, as soon as we were married, found he couldn't be ready under a month, at least, and sent us off to spend our honeymoon wherever we liked. Amy had once got Valrosa a regular honeymoon home, so we went there, and were as happy as people are but once in their lives. My fate, wasn't it love among the roses?" I think this is interesting because there's this moment, "Of course you did, you always have things to suit you," and he says, "Not always." I heard people saying that, oh, this is why, because Laurie is still in love with Jo. But then we have all these moments when he speaks about his romantic moments with Amy, so this is very confusing to a lot of people. I was thinking how interesting it is how Louisa May Alcott always tends to sort of includes herself in her novels to be part of a triangle. Because even in Moods, that was before she met Laddie Wisniewski when she wrote it, there is this archetype that is based on Henry David Thoreau and another one that is based on Emerson that are kind of fighting over her. So I think it's interesting how she just keeps repeating this similar plotline of herself being in a triangle.
Yeah, I have to say, and when it's like not always, I think privately, I think he kind of thanked Jo in his mind for that, because I think had he married Jo, I don't think he would have been happy at all, because he would not have grown up, and people need to grow up, and Laurie needed that as well, and with Amy he did grow up indeed.
Yes, I agree. I think that's where we get into this problem that we have with Laurie's character, because he's never really shown to grow up in the adaptations, when he clearly grows up in this novel. I was reading Undine and Sintram, and even that book has this triangle with sort of a Louisa May Alcott archetype. In Rose in Bloom we have Rose and then Mac and Charlie, and then in Work we have David and Fletcher and Christie. But I think at the time period when this book was written, it was actually very romantic to have these sort of triangles in a lot of these stories, because Goethe has many triangles in his books.
It's funny that Louisa May Alcott makes her main heroine always end up with the more mature person.
Exactly.
And the other person either finds another person like Laurie, or they just stay their friends, or they die like Charlie, which is kind of sad. But I wonder how Charlie would have improved if he had stayed alive. But I also think it was important that Louisa May Alcott did have him die, not because that was the only way for Meg and Rose to be together, but because it showed that everything has its consequences. And Charlie, I think he was a very alcoholic person, or something like that. I can't remember it quite right now, but I think it's very important because it showed that she wasn't just some writer who only made sunshiny tales, because that's the reality. In reality, if, for example, you drink too many alcohol or something, it has consequences.
Yeah, he had a big drinking problem. And I don't think, even if Rose would have had a better impact on him, that he would stop drinking. I think Rose would have still end up with Mag, because Mag is the Frederick archetype.
Yeah, definitely.
It's important to know these things, because people are so obsessed with Joe and Laurie that during this time period, Laurie's character, I believe, is very much based on Wilhelm Meister. And in Wilhelm Meister, we have Natalia and Mariana. And Wilhelm falls in love with Natalia, who is the Amy archetype. And Louisa May Alcott has this note. When Wilhelm falls in love with Natalia, he grows from a boy to be a man. And that is exactly what happens to Laurie. There never really was an alternative to this, because if Laurie would have ended up with Joe, like you said, he would have been miserable because he would have stayed in that childlike state because Joe was always the mother for him.
And it's also kind of sad that people want these two to end up together, because who would want to marry somebody they have like a maternal or parent-like relationship to? Of course, in relationships, I'm pretty sure people do quarrel. I have never been in one, so I cannot say it. But the thing is, quarrels are, of course, part of it. But the problem I also see with the Joe-Laurie pairing is that their quarrels have been very harmful to both these characters. They would not have, they would have harmed these two pretty much. And I don't think, like I said, quarrels are of course important and they might help people to overcome what they have. But the thing is that with Joe and Laurie, it would have made each of them much more miserable, and they would have clashed even more because of these quarrels.
Yeah, and the problem was also because even here, when Laurie speaks about Amy, it's really hard to imagine that he would say same things about Joe, about these moments among roses in Rosa.
Yeah, that's true. I don't think he ever could talk about Joe like that, because Joe, when he proposed to her, she was more like an ideal and not like a real person to him.
We can definitely see that in the Vienna chapter when he imagines the dream woman that he is going to court everywhere. And to me, it's always so funny because I think it's something that you might do when you are like a 15-year-old and imagine that you are dating a singer or a boy band character or a person who doesn't exist. And you just create this fantasy. And when Laurie does that, he's like 23, 22 years old. And you would think that he would be more of an adult at that age, but he isn't. Until he starts to remember the things that Amy said to him of being lazy. And, people like Laurie because he tends to be this dreamy looking guy. These dreams that he has, they are not at all realistic. And I think it's part of the problem is that he has been sort of given everything. But then he's also seems very miserable because he doesn't have that family unit.
Yeah, and I also think just because he's more conventionally good-looking, people also are like Joe and Laurie should have been together because they imagine Joe to be also conventionally good-looking, which is actually Amy and Meg are conventionally good-looking. But in this chapter, the passage was that our external appearances are that they all in the end pass away, and that only true love and the soul kind of things are the things that stay when the person gets old. Yes, that's also, it again shows that for Laurie it should not have mattered, but it should have mattered how his character is, because I think many people are like this when a person looks good, kind of, that they just gloss over the fact that this person may not be such a good person as in fact of behaving or something like that.
Yeah, I haven't read the Louisa May Alcott thriller. What was the name of it? Love Chase. Dangerous Love Chase. Doesn't it have that kind of plot? That there is this conventionally good-looking guy that doesn't turn out to be that great?
Yeah, it's kind of also a stalker story. And like I said, it's a thriller, so what I like about it is that it shows that men can be creepy. Yeah, I think Philip Tempest was conventionally good looking. I do not remember it, but again in Philip I see Laurie, but not more like an adult. And with adult, I mean the fact that Laurie is pretty much spoiled and acts like a child. And with Father Ignatius, which is the Friedrich archetype, I kind of really see Friedrich in him. Like I said, but I still prefer Friedrich as a character because you get to see Friedrich much more, and I just love that.
That is true. Charlie in Rosenblum was also very conventionally good-looking character. That when Mac was kind of described to be chubby and have glasses and more like Frederick, then Charlie is described to be very handsome and very rich. Like both Mac and Charlie are rich, but like Charlie is the conventionally good-looking character, but he's also the one with the addiction. He has this element of sadness in him. I've heard people who really said, oh, they wanted Charlie and Rose to be together. When I talk to them, it always feels like they wanted them to be together because they found Charlie a lot more attractive than Mac physically. So I think you are right when you say maybe find Laurie more dreamy and sort of this fantasy because they think that Laurie is attractive.
I actually love that Mac wears glasses because I think people with glasses in general aren't really represented correctly. As someone who wears glasses, I always think it is odd that in many movie scenes or something, there's a makeover. Like in Rose and Bloom, Mac also gets one. But then Rose, I think Rose didn't like it, and Mac himself also didn't like it. And it kind of critiques also the fact that just because a person has this kind doesn't mean that he doesn't wear glasses or doesn't look like, I don't know, a man from a magazine which has tons of Photoshop or something.
I actually talked about this with my mom some time ago, that actually it's thanks to Harry Potter that people are way more acceptable to those who wear glasses. I'm not a huge fan of J.K. Rowling at the moment, but I appreciate that, and I think it's true.
Yeah. Right now, her statements and all that stuff are kind of a bit weird, but I like the fact that she included people with glasses and all that stuff, and yeah, that was nice.
That's something we can appreciate. I myself wear reading glasses, but I can't say I have seen lots of like big Hollywood movies where the romantic lead wears glasses.
Yeah, me neither.
With the makeover, they just switched to contact lenses, and I can't wear contact lenses because they hurt my eyes. I would like to see more people with glasses in movies. You're correct.
It's also, like I said, kind of sad because I want to be represented. Like, okay, it's not like I can't see without my glasses, but there are sure people who cannot see without their glasses, and it is also kind of insulting, I'm pretty sure, for them, because it's like, who needs to have glasses when you can look conventionally good looking, and that is everybody's dream. Like, that isn't true.
I always wondered why Rosenblum has not been adapted, because it's such a good story, and it's, I think, together with Little Woman, it's probably Louisa May Alcott's most famous book. Money-wise, it has been sold a lot. I've heard some people saying that it's because Mac and Rose are cousins, but I think for modern adaptations, they can go around that somehow. Like, Rose can be adopted, or Mac could be adopted, or maybe they are not relatives, maybe they are just come from family that are close.
Or like, for example, the kind of cousins that, like, maybe, I don't know, they don't have to be blood cousins, and I have to say, it's okay, I come from a country where cousins marriages is not seen as a bad thing. I don't know how I see it, but I most likely wouldn't want to marry my cousin because he reminds me of Laurie, and he kind of freaks me out sometimes, and it's like, no, sure there are people who can marry their cousins because they feel such a good connection. Of course, maybe the children of those people may have something because of the similar genetics, but other than that, I think they could maybe change it in the adaptations, but they could also not change it, because then again it would be a good representation of that time period.
That is true. Yeah, somebody said that, well, it was very common in the 19th century, so maybe it should not be changed. I don't know. I would like to see Rose in Bloom adapted. I don't care are they cousins or if they are not cousins. But of course it was very common in the 19th century because, Rose in Bloom, it takes place in a very high society. Like Rose is from a very rich family and Mac and Charlie are from rich families and their fathers are brothers. They want to keep the money in the family, so that's why Rose really have to choose between these two cousins. Yes, I think if you explain that well in the movie or in a TV series, people would understand that.
In general, I wouldn't say love has no boundaries. Like I said, I cannot know it. But I would say as long as two people respect and love each other, and as long as they feel comfortable together, I don't think society should be in a position to judge them.
Yeah, I don't know enough about this topic. I do know that in 18th century it was very common in Finland to marry your cousins, but not now. And obviously in 19th century America as well.
I think in Turkey maybe a bit. I do have a neighbor here, and she was married to a cousin, but not because she loved him. It was, I think, an arranged marriage, and I hate arranged marriages. But that is an example I have, but they are no longer together. So I don't know whether it counts, but she still had to marry him, so I guess it counts.
Well, that's a bit like the Rose in Bloom situation, because Rose was expected to marry someone rich, even if she would not marry her cousins. But I'm glad she married Mac, because that was author's intention all along.
Yes, I also have to say I love their relationship. I also love the girl that Mac adopted, kind of. It was also very sweet.
It was another one of those very much like a Frederick Bear moments, because you can see that Mac was this person who really wanted to start a family. And then Rose, she was like a baby crazy as soon as she saw him with the child. And it's kind of the same with Joe and Frederick.
Yes, and I also think it's a positive representation that men also want children and a family as much as women, because I have to say in some series it's like the woman doesn't want children and the man forces her, but this isn't the case in Louisa May Alcott's stories at all. Like all the characters who have a family of their own, the child is a want of both parties. It's also very positive because it again shows her being feminist, because men and women should be equal and they should have equal wants and needs, and that is important.
And I don't think there are enough men in pop culture that are really shown to be this way, that they are these good father figures.
Yeah, and I think tender men in general in pop culture or something, or in movies, they are most likely friend zoned and then by the main character, and then they do get together. But I think it is kind of harmful to portray them as always kind of more like the second choice, as I call it. And that's why in one of my novels, I do have many, but the one I write right now, I have the main character love interest to be a very tender person. He is very emotional, and he's also very open with the fact that he's emotional. He isn't ashamed of it. I try to write characters like that because they are important and they are part of our environment.
And it's really harmful the way men are taught not to show emotions or not to cry. It leads in all kinds of problems, and it's the same with women, because we are also taught not to show emotion and not to cry, or we are being told that it's weakness. We just talked about the way Joe behaves like this. I think both Laurie and Frederick are actually more emotional compared to Joe, at least in the beginning, because they are way more open to express their feelings. And in some chapter before this, when Laurie is trying to flirt with Joe, and Joe is puts literally the pillow between them, there are some moments when Laurie is annoyed with Joe I think he says that you bottle up your feelings, you don't show emotion. He was right. Like, Jo thinks that being this emotional, vulnerable person makes her weak.
Yeah.
And we see that also in this chapter that we are reading here.
It's very impactful that she learns to embrace herself.
I think Beth's death also had a big part on that, because I always think that Beth is almost like a female Frederick, because Beth, she has such an empathic worldview, so being with Beth always brings out Jo's softer side, or that she's reminded to feel more empathy towards others. It's okay to show more emotion.
Yeah, to forget Jo for a minute. And Jo was glad of it, for the fact that he told her all these things so freely and naturally assured her that he had quite forgiven and forgotten. She tried to draw away her hand, but, as if he guessed the thought that prompted the half-involuntary impulse, Laurie held it fast, and said with a manly gravity she had never seen in him before, "Jo, dear, I want to say one thing, and then we'll put it by forever. As I told you in my letter when I wrote that Amy had been so kind to me, I shall never stop loving you, but the love is altered, and I have learned to see that it is better as it is. Amy and you changed places in my heart, that's all. I think it was all meant to be so, and would have come out naturally if I had waited, as you tried to make me, but I never could be patient, and so I got a heartache. I was a boy then, headstrong and violent. It took a hard lesson to show me my mistake, for it was one, Jo, as you said, and I found it out after making a fool of myself. Upon my word, I was so tumbled up in my mind at one time that I didn't know which I loved best, you or Amy, and tried to love both alike, and I couldn't. When I saw her in Switzerland, everything seemed to clear up all at once. We both got into your right places, and I felt sure that it was well off with the old love before it was on with the new, that I could, for honesty, share my heart between Sister Jo and wife Amy, and love them both dearly. Will you believe it, and go back to the happy old times when we trusted in one another? I believe it, with all my heart, but Teddy, we never can be boy and girl again. The happy old times can't come back, and we must expect it. We are man and woman now, with sober work to do, for playtime is over, and we must give up frolicking. I'm sure you feel this. I see the change in you, and you'll find it in me. I shall miss my boy, but I shall love the man as much, and admire him the more, because he means to be what I hoped he would. We can't be little playmates any longer, but we will be brother and sister, to love and help one another all our lives, won't we, Laurie?" He did not say a word, but took the hand she offered him, and laid his face down on it for a minute, feeling that out of the grave of a boyish passion there had risen a beautiful, strong friendship to bless them both. Presently Jo said cheerfully, for she didn't want their coming home to be a sad one, "I can't make it true that your children are really married and going to set up housekeeping. Why, it seems only yesterday that I was buttoning Amy's pinafore and pulling your hair when you teased. Mercy me, how time does fly. As one of the children is older than yourself, you needn't talk so like a grandma. I flatter myself I'm a gentleman grown, as Peggotty said of David, and when you see Amy, you'll find her rather a precocious infant," said Laurie, looking amused at her maternal air. "You may be a little older in years, but I'm ever so much older in feeling, Teddy. Women always are. And this last year has been such a hard one that I feel 40.
This reminds me in Little Men, when there's a scene when Laurie comes to visit Jo at Plumfield, and he says that he was the first boy that Jo raised. And I think there is even a moment when he calls her grandmother.
Yeah, I like the way Laurie talks to Jo now, much better than I like the way he used to talk to her. Because, first of all, now there's respect. He also kind of mocks her, like calling her grandma. But I have to say, it again showcases his growth.
This really annoyed me in the 2019 film when Greta Gerwig said that Laurie wants Jo to step into adulthood, but here it is really the opposite, because he kind of says, like, can we go on and be this frolicking brother and sister again? And Jo says that, no, we cannot. You're both adults now.
It's also kind of weird that when I first watched the 29th adaptation, I kind of liked it. Went back to the book, the more I actually started to dislike it because Laurie's growth isn't there at all, and Amy has been painted as more aggressive. And the thing is, while I like Amy as a character and I like that Greta Gerwig focused on her more, I dislike that Amy was made more aggressive because it didn't feel like the Amy I knew and loved, because I also wrote to you that it's like Amy and Joe are both like water. Joe at first is the ice. She like tries to break everything to get what she wants, but Amy is like the swift river, the swift water, which like places itself and nobody notices that she has placed herself there. It's just like as if it has always been there. So I don't really like the fact that they made her more aggressive, because she then kind of lost her ladylike character, which she used in manipulating the system to get her to her goal.
I think they made Joe also too aggressive because of the feedback scene. She doesn't shout to Friedrich in the book that he's a bully, which is really weird because in the book Joe wants Friedrich's feedback because she wants to improve as a writer. So I felt like it was sort of making fun of Joe's desire to become a writer.
It's also kind of weird that they had Rose's quote. When Joe talked to Mommy, it was like a quote from Rose and Blue. Mm-hmm. And I'm just like, why can't you just stick to one book, please? Because it's so weird. And I was shocked to find it in there because it actually is a completely different context in that novel.
Yes. It's from the moment when Rose hears her family member speaking about her future marriage, which hasn't happened yet. And she's like, she wants to marry for love and not for money. Then I hear so many people saying that, oh, they love it when Joe says that in the movie. And I'm like, that's not a quote that Joe says at all in the book. It's from Rose in Blue.
And I have to say, I like the quote. And that's what people like, that Joe says it. But the thing is, like you said, it was Rose who said that and not Joe, because Joe at that time was feeling so completely lonely, and she was like, I'm going to die all alone, etc. I'll never be loved by anybody. Like, she kind of was in a depression-like state, if you think of it, if Friedrich and Amy and Laurie hadn't come there.
Yeah, I think that is true. It reminds me that poem that Louisa May Alcott wrote. Then it's repeated in Under the Umbrella, but it has been changed because it's a lot more hopeful in Under the Umbrella. And the poem that Louisa May Alcott wrote, it's about her coping with her depression, really. And it's not really that nice.
Yeah, it made me sad when I first read it. I was like, is this how I'm going to end up and how I'm going to feel? But when I read that in Under the Umbrella, I of course noticed that it was changed. And I also think it was good that Mother Chapter changed it, because Great Woman still is, I wouldn't say a children's book, but it is still, like, in this book, a book that children themselves also could read it, like adults as well as children and teenagers. So I think also it's good that she changed that poem, because otherwise maybe children, when they read it, would feel a bit discomforted and sad.
I don't see Little Woman as a children's book, even though I read it as a child for the first time.
Yeah, I also think it's a series everybody from every age can read, unless people who's the age of 0 because they can't read it. I believe the little sinners attached themselves to a grandpa who had spectacles on. Amy, who was handed about like refreshments, returned to the parlor on Father Lawrence's arm. The others paired off as before, and this arrangement left Joel companionless. She did not mind it at the minute, for she lingered to answer Hannah's eager inquiry. Will Miss Amy ride in a coupe and use all them lovely silver dishes that's stored away over yonder? Shouldn't wonder if she drove 6 white horses, 8 of gold plate, and wore diamonds and on point lace every day. Teddy thinks nothing too good for her, returned Joe, with infinite satisfaction. No more there is. Will you have hash or fish balls for breakfast? Asked Hannah, who wisely mingled poetry and prose. I don't care. And Joe shut the door, feeling that food was a genial topic just then. He stood a minute looking at the party vanishing above, and as Davy's short plate legs toiled up the last stair, a sudden sense of loneliness came over her, so strongly that she looked about with her dim eyes as if to find something to lean upon, for even Teddy had deserted her. If she had known what birthday gift was coming every minute nearer and nearer, she would not have said to herself, I'll weep a little weep when I go to bed. It won't do to be the smile now. Then she drew her hand over her eyes, for one of her boyish habits was never to know where her handkerchief was, and had just managed to call up a smile when there came a knock at the porch door. She opened it with a hospital haste, and started as if the ghost had to come to surprise her, for there stood a tall, bearded gentleman, beaming on from her from the darkness like a midnight sun. Oh, Mr. Bear, I am so glad to see you, cried Joe, with a clutch, as if she feared the night would swallow him up before she could get him. And I to see you, Miss Marsh. But no, you have a party. And the professor paused at the sound of voices, and the tap of dancing feet came down to them. No, we haven't. Only the family. My brother and sister have just come home, and we are all very happy. Come in and make one of us. Though a very social man, I think Mr. Bear would have gone decorously away, and come again another day. But how could he when Joe shut the door behind him and bereft him of his hat? Perhaps her face had something to do with it, for she forgot to hide her joy at seeing him, and showed it with frankness, and proved irresistible to the solitary man whose welcome far exceeded his boldest hopes.
I must have read this maybe 100 times. This is one of my favorite scenes in Little Woman because she's so happy to see him, and then she invites him in, and he feels like he's come home because the family is so welcoming to him.
Yeah, I think I also mentioned it earlier. He didn't want to be a burden to her, but then when she just shovels him into the house, he feels welcome. He feels directly welcome. He's like, okay, this is my new family, kind of. He directly feels the love and the union and the compassion of everybody.
I think it was one of the Alcott scholars who I talked with. I think it was Laura Walls. She said that she loved that the March family just adopted Frederick right away to be part of their family. Well, it's the same what they did with Laurie, actually. But it also goes along with this idea how Joe wants to rescue these lost boys, but then obviously Frederick is not a lost boy. Still, her fondness for boys and men in general, you can see that in Little Woman in the way Joe and the Marches sort of quote-unquote rescue these boys and men to be part of their family.
And she smiles and feels so happy to see him, and I think that's also very cute.
And it's really the same, like when she's in New York, she cannot hide from people around her how much she admires Frederick, because I think, especially when she writes those letters to Mommy, it's all about him. She even called the letters Berry. Mommy definitely knew what was going on.
Teddy. It's funny that his name is Teddy Bear.
Yeah.
Because children, and I also love the fact that his name is Teddy Bear. First of all, it's cute, and second of all, I also have to say about the fact that Marmee knew that Joe was in love with Friedrich. I think Marmee also kind of sensed that there was something going to happen between Laurie and Amy as well. I don't know, but I just always had the impression that he knew that there was going to happen something between the two.
People who only watched the films probably don't know this, but in first part of Little Woman, Joe kind of wishes that Laurie would marry Meg, because then Laurie would be her brother. Then she mistakes that Beth is in love with Laurie when Beth gets ill, and she kind of wishes that, Beth and Laurie would make a nice match. And then there's also a moment in some chapters earlier where she thinks, way before she knows that Amy and Laurie are meeting together in Europe, that Amy would actually make a good wife for Laurie, so she was always trying to pair Laurie with some of her sisters, but not to herself.
Yes, it's also funny because she's like, he can be with whomever he falls in love with. Just don't let it be me.
She never wanted to be with him romantically because she was in love with Frederick.
It also is kind of cute that she cares about her sisters in that way because, you know, like Laurie is rich. And if one of her sisters, like Meg or Beth or Amy, which in the end did marry him, I think she also was like, he is rich and he can provide for my sister, also for the family, if that is what he wants to.
Though a very social man, I think Mr. Bear would have gone decorously away and come again another day. But how could he, when Jo shut the door behind him and bereft him of his hat? Perhaps her face had something to do with it, for she forgot to hide her joy at seeing him and showed it with a frankness that proved irresistible to the solitary man, whose welcome far exceeded his boldest hopes. If I shall not be Monsieur de Trop, I will so gladly see you have been ill, my friend. He put the question abruptly, for as Jo hung up his coat, the light fell on her face, and he saw a change in it. Not ill, but tired and sorrowful. We have had trouble since I saw you last. Oh yes, I know. My heart was sore for you when I heard that. And he shook hands again with such a sympathetic face that Jo felt as if no comfort could equal the look of the kind eyes, the grasp of the big warm hand. Father, mother, this is my friend Professor Bear, she said, with a face and tone of such irrepressible pride and pleasure that she might as well have blown a trumpet and opened the door with a flourish. If the stranger had had any doubts about his reception, they were set at rest in a minute by the cordial welcome he received. Everyone greeted him kindly for Jo's sake at first, but very soon they liked him for his own. They could not help it, for he carried the talisman that opens all hearts, and these simple people warmed to him at once, feeling even the more friendly because he was poor, for poverty enriches those who live above it, and is a sure passport to truly hospitable spirits. Mr. Bear sat looking about him with the air of a traveller who knocks at a strange door, and when it opens, finds himself at home. The children went to him like bees to a honey-pot, and establishing themselves on each knee, proceeded to captivate him by riffling his pockets, pulling his beard, and investigating his watch with juvenile audacity. The women telegraphed their approval to one another, and Mr. March, feeling that he had got a kindred spirit, opened his choicest stores for his guest benefit. While silent, John listened and enjoyed the talk, but said not a word, and Mr. Lawrence found it impossible to go to sleep. Yes, I do love that. Jo is very proud to introduce Fredrik to the family.
I think when she introduces him, it's immediately clear that these two are going to have a relationship because the way she introduces him. I always imagine Jo to smile shyly while saying that. I also have to say, I think it's funny that it says that Mr. Lawrence actually wanted to go to sleep, but now he cannot go to sleep.
Yeah.
Always left at that line. I think it's very sweet that John listened and also enjoyed his Friedrich's talk. I think in the manual it is said that John was Friedrich's best friend or something, and you can also see that being established right here because he immediately enjoys Friedrich's talk.
I always thought that they were good friends, because I think Laurie and Friedrich were also friends, but because Laurie was so much younger, and then John is closer to Friedrich's age, that would make much more sense that they'd be good friends. Of course, Laurie and John were friends, but he would always see him also as his older teacher. But also because John knew how to speak German. He could speak German with John and with Jo in the family.
If Jo had not been otherwise engaged, Laurie's behavior would have amused her, for a faint twinge, not of jealousy, but something like suspicion, caused the gentleman to step in foot first, and observed the newcomer with brotherly circumspection. But it did not last long. He got interested in spite of himself, and before he knew it, was drawn into the circle, for Mr. Burr talked well in this genial atmosphere, and did himself justice. He seldom spoke to Laurie, but he looked at him often, and a shadow would pass across his face, as if regretting his own lost youth, as he watched the young man in his prime. Then his eye would turn to Jo so wistfully that she would have surely answered the mute inquiry if she had seen it. But Jo had her own eyes to take care of, and, feeling that they could not be trusted, she prudently kept them on the little sock she was knitting, like a model maiden aunt. Delphi glanced now and then, refreshed her like sips of fresh water after a dusty walk, for the sidelong peeps showed her several vicious moments. Mr. Burr's face had lost the absent-minded expression, and looked all the life of interest in the present moment. Actually young and handsome, she thought, forgetting to compare him with Laurie, as she usually did strange men with their great enjoyment. Then he seemed quite inspired. Though the burial costumes of the ancients, to which the conversation had strayed, might not be considered an exhilarating topic, Jo quite glowed with triumph when Teddy got quenched in an argument, and thought to herself, as she watched her father's absorbed face, how he would enjoy having such a man as my professor to talk with every day. Lastly, Mr. Burr was dressed in his spandy new suit of black, which made him look more like a gentleman than ever. His bushy hair had been cut and smoothly brushed, but didn't stay in order for long, for in exciting moments he rumpled it up the droll way he used to do, and Jo liked it rapidly erect better than flat, because she thought it gave his fine foot a jovial aspect. Poor Jo! How did she glorify that plain man, as she sat knitting away so quietly, letting nothing escape her, not even the fact that Mr. Burr had actually gold-sleeve buttons in his immaculate wristbands. Dear old fellow, he couldn't have done up himself with more care if he'd been going a wooing, said Jo to herself, and then a sudden thought, born of the words, made her blush so dreadfully that she had to drop her ball and go down after her to hide her face. The manoeuvre did not succeed as well as they expected, however, for though just in the act of setting fire to a funeral pile, the professor dropped his torch, metaphorically speaking, and made a dive after the blue little ball. Of course they bumped their heads smartly together, saw stars, and both came up flushed and laughing, without the ball, to resume their seats, wishing they had not left them. Nobody knew where the evening went to, for Hannah skillfully abstracted the babies at an early hour, nodding like two rosy puppies, and Mr. Lawrence went home to rest. All sat round the fire, talking away of the lapse of time, till Meg, whose maternal mind was impressed with a firm conviction that Daisy had tumbled out of bed, and Damie had set his nightgown afire studying a structure of mats, made a move to go. We must have our say in the good old way, for we are all together once more, said Jo, feeling that a good shout would be a safe and pleasant vent for the jubilant emotions of her soul. They were not all there, but no one found the words for thoughtless or untrue, for Beth seemed among them, a peaceful presence, invisible but clearer than ever. Death could not break the household league that love made indissoluble. The little chair stood in its old place, the tidy basket with bit of work she left unfinished when the needle grew so heavy was still on its accustomed shelf. The beloved instrument, seldom touched now, had not been moved, and above it Beth's face, serene and smiling, as in the early days, looked down upon them, seeming to say, "Be happy, I am here. Play something, Amy. Let them hear how much you have improved," said Laurie, with pardonable pride in his promising pupil. But Amy whispered with full eyes, as she twirled the thread, "Not tonight, dear. I can't show off tonight." But she did something better than brilliancy or skill, for she sang Beth's songs with a tender music in her voice which the best master could not have taught, and touched the listeners' hearts with a sweeter power than any other inspiration could have given her. The room was very still. When the clear voice failed suddenly at the last line of Beth's favorite hymn, it was heard to say, "Earth hath no sorrow that heaven cannot heal," and Amy leaned against her husband, who stood behind her, feeling that her welcome home was not perfect without Death's kiss. "Now we must finish with Mignon's song, for Mr. Burr sings then, said Joe before the pause grew painful, and Mr. Burr cleared his throat with a grateful hem. As he stepped into the corner where Joe stood, saying, "You will sing with me. We go excellently well together."
I think this is the part where Laurie is really proud of Amy's musical talents, like you said.
Yes, and I also think I wrote that to you in our private chat. First, like, he doesn't go to Mr. Burr and he talks to him. I always had the feeling that he was kind of also a bit ashamed to talk to him because in his proposal he kind of insulted him. And I also like the fact that Joe was very proud when Friedrich kind of won an argument against Laurie. I think that is very funny because it shows that the pride and respect and love Joe has for Friedrich is very much different from the one she has for Laurie.
And I think it also shows how much Joe really has admiration for intelligence. So when Friedrich beats Laurie in a debate, to Joe, that shows how Friedrich is this intelligent guy and speaks to her in a way that Laurie can never be because Laurie doesn't have that similar love for knowledge or education that she has.
Yeah, definitely. I think it is nice that everybody kind of notices that there is something in the air because Joe is very prideful of Mr. Burr. By the way, I call him Mr. Burr because Joe says in it that it isn't bear nor beer, so I just make it boo instead of bear. I don't know, it's just my way of calling it that. And I also think it's very nice is how when Amy sings a song and then her voice fails at one part, that also shows again the lovely bond they had as siblings. And I think I just spotted a kiss scene because I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but it says that Laurie feels that Amy's Welcome Home was not quite perfect without Beth's kiss, so I think maybe he kissed her or something to make her, feel better.
I love that. You are also pronouncing Friedrich's name correctly with the German pronunciation. I don't know if it's the American or English way when I say Friedrich, but Friedrich is the original German way. Not Frederick, never Frederick, but Friedrich or Friedrich. But you are doing correctly with the German accent, which I am not so good at.
Of course, I can't speak it correctly, because like I said, I do know German, so it's easy to me. I also have to say, I like that Louisa May Alcott had Friedrich speak in a German accent. I don't know, I think it's very sweet. And I also think in this passage, it's very nice that they all still feel Beth's presence, that they all feel that she's still there. This also again showcases the bond Beth had with her family in general. Another thing that I really like about this passage is that Mr. Burr, Friedrich, and Mr. March, they really hit along, they just meet and then they instantly have this good chemistry with each other. It is also very nice because it again showcases how Friedrich has the ability to immediately befriend people, and again, this is kind of his outgoing nature.
I love this moment when Joe is like, "Oh, I wish Father would have a person like Professor to speak with him every day," and then she realizes, "Oh, maybe he actually came to see me, not my father." And it's kind of funny how she just realizes that maybe he came to see me, and that's when she drops the ball. And this is so funny. I always read this as Joe's sexual awakening, together with the sequence in New York, because obviously she doesn't have these kind of feelings for Laurie, never in this book, or anyone else for that matter. But this is so funny when they head together and then they come up flushed and laughing and embarrassed.
Yeah, I also laugh at the team very much. I also think it is very sweet because many people, I think, who read the book are probably thinking when they don't like the Joe and Friedrich pairing that they aren't romantic. But the thing is, for me, I guess Joe and Friedrich's romance is real life. Meg and John and Amy and Laurie also are a bit more idealistic romance, but Joe and British are this real life romance, as I put it. And I also think it is very cute that they bump heads together, because it kind of again showcases that they have a very good bond, because like they crash heads, their bodies meet kind of, and so do their hearts.
This is also funny how she, in her mind, she calls him as my professor, but even when Laurie proposed to Joe, was it a year or 2 years earlier? I think it was a year earlier, year and a half. Anyway, she still calls him my professor.
Yeah, without even truly getting that she was actually in love with him, that is also very impactful. She just is like, don't you dare abuse my professor, or else I shall get mad. And when Laurie is like, marry me, if you don't, I will kill myself, don't tell me you love that old man.
He was already then her professor. And here again, how he would enjoy having such a man as my professor talk with every day. So he was always her professor.
Yeah, and Laurie was always my boy. I think many people confuse the fact that on my professor, emphasis is on my, and for me, and on my boy, it's the emphasis is put on boy and not on my. I always imagined it to be that way, because I think even in the sequels, Joe still calls him, I think, my boy. I'm not sure, but I think she does call him it. And I mean, that should make clear that the emphasis is on my boy. She still kind of sees Laurie as a boy for her, and not as a man she could marry.
Yes, it's always a boy and never a man. Not like my man and my husband. That's Friedrich. Laurie is always the boy. She sees him more as her child, even though Laurie is a couple months older. He's always her child.
Yeah, that is true. And I love the way Joe acts around Friedrich, because she's kind of a bit awkward, but also very proud. And I think it is very funny, because I think I could imagine Louisa May Alcott also to be like that when she was around Henry David Thoreau. I don't know, it always was like, maybe she's like that as well when she's around Thoreau. You don't know. But I always thought so. And I also have to say, I think it's very funny how Joe has to keep her eyes on her ball she's knitting, because otherwise she will constantly look at Friedrich. But when she does look at him, it's like taking a fresh cup of tea or something, because she gets refreshed, and she even calls him handsome. She has fallen in love with him. Somebody once told me or something, it was like love beautifies a person, or love makes you think that the person you fall in love with is the most beautiful person in the world. You kind of do not see physical or general flaws.
That is true. Yeah, she says actually young and handsome.
He is kind of more mature than the rest of them, except for Mr. March, and Mrs. March, and Hannah, and Mr. Lawrence. But I think, other than that, I don't think he's older. I just think, losing his sister Minna and having to care for his nephews, I think just made him grow up a bit faster than the others, because, he and Joe have, around 15 years each gap or something like that, and while it is a bit much, maybe, I don't think that there's a difference in how they feel and how they act and how they see the world.
That was our discussion for today. Thank you so much for listening. Take care and make good choices. Bye.